There is a phrase that has followed Meghan Markle across an ocean. It was whispered first in the corridors of Kensington Palace, then printed in London's broadsheets, and eventually it washed up on the sun-bleached patios of Montecito, California, where it remains attached to her name to this day. The phrase is Duchess difficult. Tonight we are going to follow it all the way back to where it started. The headlines are always about Meghan, but the story underneath them, the one that keeps getting buried beneath denials and lawyers' letters, is not really about her at all. It is about the people who stood closest to her, the assistants, the private secretaries, the communications staff, the women especially, who were assigned to help her find her footing inside a 1,000-year-old institution, and whose entire job was to make her shine. Most of them are gone now. Some left in tears, some left in silence. A few left and then, years later, finally began to talk. They gave themselves a name, a grim little joke that tells you almost everything about how they remember those years. They called themselves the Sussex Survivors Club. So here is the question that has hung over the House of Windsor for the better part of a decade, and which refuses to die, no matter how many times it is denied. Was Meghan Markle a modern woman crushed by a cold institution that was never going to accept her? Or was she someone whose ambition and temper left a trail of broken careers behind her? Was she the victim of a calculated smear campaign, as she has always insisted? Or did the women around her quietly pay the price for something the palace decided to bury? I have spent a long time with the public record on this. The leaked emails, the formal complaint, the on-the-record interviews from people who were actually in those rooms. Tonight I am going to lay all of it out fairly and completely, and I am not going to flinch from either side. Every story has the version that gets shouted and the version that gets whispered. By the end of the next 2.5 hours you will be able to decide for yourself which one you believe. One quick thing before we go any further. If you find these deep dives into the hidden machinery of the monarchy as fascinating as I do, tap subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it is the single biggest thing you can do to keep this channel digging into the stories the official accounts would rather you forgot. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a time before any of it had gone wrong. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand how it all came apart, you first have to understand how high the hopes were. In the beginning, Meghan Markle was not a problem. In the beginning, she looked like the answer to a prayer. Think back to 2017. For all its pageantry, the British monarchy had a quiet worry running underneath it. It was old, it was overwhelmingly white, and to a great many young people it had started to feel like a museum exhibit, a row of elderly figures in gilt frames waving from a balcony. Then Prince Harry, the spare, the wild one, the boy the world had watched walk behind his mother's coffin, brought home someone genuinely new. She was American, she was biracial, she was a working actress with her own career, her own money, and her own opinions, and she ran a lifestyle blog about food and travel and self-improvement. She carried herself with a confidence the royal family had simply never encountered at close range. She gave speeches about feminism. As a child, she had written a letter to a soap company demanding it change a sexist advertisement, and she had won. Here, the optics seemed to say, was the future. Here was the person who might finally drag the monarchy into the 21st century. At first, the public response was rapturous. 2 billion people watched the 2018 wedding. A gospel choir sang "Stand By Me" in the chapel at Windsor. An American bishop preached on the redemptive power of love and left half the congregation stunned and the other half delighted. For one luminous afternoon it felt like a real turning point, as if the institution had finally learned how to bend. But 2 billion viewers could not see what was happening behind the fairy tale. In the offices and back corridors of Kensington Palace, a machine was already grinding, and the people caught inside it were beginning, very quietly, to panic. The royal household runs on rules unlike any other workplace on earth. The hours are brutal. The pay, measured against the talent it attracts, is often surprisingly poor, because people take these jobs for prestige and proximity rather than money. Above all, it runs on absolute invisible deference. You do not complain, you do not make noise. You serve, you keep the secrets, and you protect the principle, which is the household's own word for the royal you work for. Turnover in these jobs is high even at the best of times because the work is intense and the rewards are mostly intangible. That much is true, and Meghan's defenders are right to point it out. Into this world walked a 36-year-old woman from Los Angeles who had spent her whole adult life somewhere completely different. American television, where you advocate hard for yourself, where you push for what you want, where a strong woman who demands excellence is admired rather than feared. Almost at once, those two worlds began to grind against each other. Meghan was given staff to help her, some of the best the institution had. One of the first and most important was a woman named Samantha Cohen. Remember that name, because she matters enormously later. For now, understand who she was. Cohen had worked for the royal family since 2001, close to 2 decades inside the machine. She was Australian, seasoned, almost impossible to rattle, and she had served on the late Queen Elizabeth's own staff. If you wanted someone to teach a newcomer every protocol and every sensitivity and where all the landmines were buried, Samantha Cohen was about as good as the institution had to offer. She was made Meghan's private secretary, the most senior advisor a royal has, the person who reports directly to the principal and runs their entire working life. Here is the first detail that should make you pause, and it only makes sense in light of how it ended. Cohen was supposed to stay 6 months. She stayed 18, not because things were going well, but because the household could not find anyone willing to take the job from her. Let that settle. One of the most experienced royal aides alive, a woman who had served the Queen herself, signs on for a short assignment to help the most exciting new royal in a generation, and that assignment stretches to 1.5 years because no replacement can be found. When one finally was, that person didn't last either. They flew the new recruit out to Africa on tour with Harry and Meghan to learn the ropes, and the recruit quit while they were still there. That is not the ordinary churn of a demanding workplace. That is an alarm bell ringing very softly, in a building where alarm bells are never supposed to ring at all. Samantha Cohen was not even the first to go. Before the resignations that made headlines, before any formal complaint, there was a departure so sudden and so unexpected that it left the palace, in its own words, in real shock. The woman's name was Melissa Tubati, and she had stood at the very center of the most important day of Meghan's life. Melissa was Meghan's personal assistant, and she had played a pivotal part in planning the royal wedding itself. This was not a peripheral figure. This was a trusted professional who had helped build the fairy tale that 2 billion people watched. 6 months after the wedding, she abruptly walked out. The official line was gracious, as it always is. A palace source was authorized to pay tribute, calling Melissa hugely talented, saying she had played a pivotal role in the wedding and would be missed by everyone in the household. That is the institution doing what it does best, closing ranks, smoothing the surface, making the unbearable look routine. But the same source let the real reaction slip through. Why, they asked, would she want to leave such a prestigious job so soon? Read it again and the bewilderment is genuine. Why would anyone walk away from one of the most coveted positions in the world only months after pulling off its crowning achievement? The full answer would take years to surface, and it would not be flattering. In the account Meghan's accusers eventually put forward, Melissa Tubati did not simply choose to leave a prestigious job. In that account, she was one of the people later described, in a formal written complaint, as having been driven out. I want to be scrupulously fair here because this is exactly the kind of story where it is easy to pick a side and sprint, so consider the other reading, the one Meghan's defenders have always pressed. Palace turnover is genuinely high. New royals routinely shed people assigned to them as they work out who they actually want around them. Aides leave royal service for 100 ordinary reasons: burnout, better offers, the simple grinding exhaustion of the work. Some of the people on the famous departures lists left because they were emigrating, or because their particular role had become redundant once a specific task was done. Not every exit is a scandal. Some are just life. There is a more sympathetic frame still, and it deserves real weight rather than a quick wave. Picture a woman of color, an outsider, an American who did not know the unwritten rules, dropped into the most rigid institution in the Western world, an institution that by Harry's own later account contained people who resented her, briefed against her, and wanted her to fail. In that reading, the difficult label is not evidence of how Meghan behaved. It is evidence of how the establishment treats a woman who refuses to make herself small. Plenty of serious people hold this view, and the early departures on their own do nothing to disprove it. Both readings are real. Both have credible defenders, and the honest truth is that for the opening stretch of this story you can genuinely hold either one, because a handful of resignations by themselves prove nothing. So why did this story refuse to stay a matter of opinion? Because of what came next, which was not a rumor and not an anonymous tabloid brief. What came next was a senior, named, highly credible royal official sitting down and putting his concerns in writing. A formal email sent to the most powerful private secretary in the building, using a single word that the royal family does not reach for lightly. The word was bullying. The man who wrote it was Jason Knauf. We are going to read exactly what Knauf wrote, close to word for word, because the language is genuinely shocking and because it is now part of the public record. But to understand why that email landed like an explosion, you first have to understand the pressure cooker it was written inside, the frantic, sleepless, high-stakes machine of a working royal household in 2018. You have to understand the emails that were said to arrive at 5 in the morning. You have to understand what it actually felt like to be on the receiving end of them. That daily reality, the experience of working for the woman the world had just fallen in love with, is where we are going next. If you're still with me, do the one small thing and hit subscribe, then tell me down in the comments which way you are leaning right now, the target or the tyrant. Hold on to your answer, because part 2 is going to test it. Every job has a rhythm, and the rhythm tells you what kind of place it really is. To understand the household Meghan ran, you have to understand the rhythm her staff described, because it is the texture of those ordinary days repeated hundreds of times that builds a reputation long before anyone ever writes the word bullying down on paper. The detail that surfaced first, and the one that stuck hardest, was the timing of the messages. The newspapers reported that requests would land in inboxes as early as 5 in the morning. Now, on its own, an early email proves nothing. Plenty of driven people wake before dawn and fire off their thoughts before the day swallows them. But the staff who described those messages were not complaining about the hour for its own sake. They were describing what the hour signaled. A message at 5 in the morning, followed by another, followed by a third, with the expectation of a reply, tells the person on the other end that there is no boundary, no off switch, no part of the day that belongs to them. It tells them the principal's needs are total and the staffer's life is not their own. When the Sunday Times first wrote about Samantha Cohen's departure at the end of 2018, the story carried that exact note. Whoever replaced Cohen, the paper suggested, would need deep reserves of energy and patience to help Meghan define her role. Read that sentence as a hiring manager would. Reserves of energy and patience is not a description of an exciting opportunity. It is a warning, dressed in courtesy. It is the kind of thing you say when you cannot say what you actually mean. This is the period when the nickname took root. Duchess difficult. It appeared in print attached to the very real fact that Meghan had now lost a second close aide in short order. And here we have to be careful, because a nickname is a weapon, and weapons can be wielded fairly or cruelly. There is a long, ugly tradition of branding ambitious women as difficult when the same drive in a man would be called leadership. Anyone telling this story honestly has to keep that blade in view. The label could be the truth about Meghan. It could also be the establishment's reflex against a woman who would not behave. For now, hold both. What is harder to wave away is the consistency of the picture across very different witnesses in very different settings, separated by years. The descriptions that would later emerge from people who worked with Meghan in California were not gentle. One account given to The Hollywood Reporter described her as relentless, said she marched around issuing orders, and claimed to have watched her reduce grown men to tears. That is brutal language, and it is anonymous, and anonymous language is cheap, so weigh it accordingly. But notice that it rhymes with what was said in London years earlier by different people who did not know each other and had nothing to gain by coordinating. When the same shape of complaint appears on two continents from sources who never met, you are allowed to find that pattern interesting. You are not yet allowed to call it proof. So what was the experience actually like for the women in the eye of it? Strip away the tabloid adjectives and you are left with something more human and more troubling. You are left with people who took a dream job and found themselves dreading their phones, People who by their own later accounts felt sick before work and stressed in Meghan's presence and uncertain, day to day, whether they were valued or about to be discarded. Whatever the cause, that is a real description of real suffering, and it does not evaporate just because the institution refused to discuss it. There is a version of all this that is sympathetic to Meghan, and it is not a weak one. Imagine arriving inside the most scrutinized family on the planet with no instruction manual, surrounded by courtiers who guard their turf and resent the newcomer, expected to perform flawlessly in front of cameras while a hostile press picks apart your every gesture. Imagine that the people assigned to help you are also, in some sense, the institution's people, loyal first to the system and only second to you. In that situation, a person might well become demanding. A person might well start sending messages at 5 in the morning, not out of cruelty but out of fear, because the cost of any mistake is a front page. Pressure flows downhill. A principal under siege can turn the household into a place under siege. That frame matters because it changes what the early morning emails mean. In one reading, they are the symptom of a bully. In another, they are the symptom of a frightened, overwhelmed woman with no support and no map. The same email looks different depending on which story you have already decided to believe. The honest position this early is to admit that the email itself cannot tell you which story is true, but the people receiving those emails did eventually decide, and the most important of them did not decide in a tabloid or on a podcast. He decided in writing, through official channels, in a way that could never be dismissed as gossip. Before we read his words, though, we need to meet him properly, because Jason Knauf is not the figure Meghan's defenders would want as their villain. He is the figure that makes this whole story so hard to dismiss. Knauf was Harry and Meghan's communications secretary. American by background, careful by temperament, he was precisely the kind of professional the palace prized: discreet, measured, allergic to drama. People who have watched him operate describe him as cautious and conservative with his words. The sort of man who chooses each phrase like he is paying for it by the syllable. This is the crucial point. When a hothead complains, you can discount it as temperament. When the calmest man in the building complains in writing using the gravest available word, you have to take it seriously. The messenger was the message. And there is one more fact about Knauf that detonates the simplest defense Meghan's camp would later reach for. Their argument, when his complaint finally surfaced, was that it was all part of a coordinated smear, enemies lining up to destroy her. But Jason Knauf was not Meghan's enemy. In fact, only a couple of years after raising his concerns, he helped Meghan win a major legal case, providing evidence that supported her side in a court fight against a newspaper. A man does not assist you in court while simultaneously running a secret campaign to ruin you. The same person who Meghan's lawyers later relied upon in a courtroom was the person who had earlier written that she was bullying her own staff. Both things are true. That is what makes him impossible to explain away. So picture the scene as 2018 turns toward its close. Behind the smiling tour photographs and the bump cradling and the magazine covers, a quiet, careful man has been watching something he does not like. He has heard the staff. He has seen the turnover. He has perhaps received a few of those dawn messages himself, and he has reached the point, which a person like him reaches only after exhausting every quieter option, where he feels he has no choice but to put it in writing and send it up the chain to the office of the future king's right-hand man. What he wrote is waiting for us in part 4. But to feel its full weight, we first have to spend real time with the woman who was supposed to be Meghan's shield and guide, the Queen's own trusted aide, who signed up for 6 months and could not get free for 18. We have to understand Samantha Cohen, because she is the one whose silence years later would speak the loudest. Stay with me, and if this is the kind of careful both-sides storytelling you want more of, subscribing is the one thing that tells the algorithm to show you the next one. Of all the people caught in this story, Samantha Cohen is the one who should never have been rattled. That is what makes her chapter the most revealing of all. By the time she came to work for Meghan, Cohen had given the better part of 2 decades to the crown. She had joined royal service in 2001 and risen to become an assistant private secretary to Queen Elizabeth herself, trusted with the most delicate corners of the most discreet household on earth. Colleagues called her unflappable. She had seen monarchs at their most human and kept every confidence. She was, in the truest sense, an institution within the institution. When the palace needed someone steady enough to guide a brand new American duchess through her first steps, Cohen was the obvious and reassuring choice. She was, in the affectionate shorthand of the press, sometimes called the Panther, a nod to her poise and her ability to move through any crisis without losing her composure. This was not a woman who frightened easily or quit on a whim. This was a woman whose entire professional identity was built on endurance and loyalty, which is exactly why what happened next carries so much weight. The arrangement was meant to be temporary. Cohen would step in as Meghan's private secretary for around 6 months, settle the new duchess, hand over to a permanent successor, and move on. That was the plan. The reality was that she stayed 18 months, not because she was thriving, but because the household could not find anyone prepared to take the role off her hands. Read that plainly. The most prestigious new posting in the royal world, working for the most talked-about woman on the planet, and they could not fill it. The job had developed a reputation, and the reputation was scaring people away. When a replacement was eventually found, the household tried to do the handover properly. They brought the newcomer along on the autumn 2018 tour of Africa, the idea being to let them shadow Cohen, learn the rhythms, absorb the protocols on the job. It did not work. The new recruit quit during the tour itself, before the handover was even complete, before they had finished learning the ropes. Whatever they experienced in those few weeks alongside Meghan was enough to make them walk away from one of the rarest jobs in the world while still standing on foreign soil. Think about what that means in practical terms. Cohen could not leave because no one would stay. The one person who agreed to try fled mid-tour. So the Queen's own trusted aide, the Panther, the woman who had handled everything, found herself trapped in a role she had only ever meant to hold briefly, unable to extract herself because the position had become unfillable. That is not the story of a workplace that is merely demanding. That is the story of a workplace that talented, experienced professionals were actively refusing to enter. Now here is the part that matters most, and the part Cohen handled with a discretion that tells you everything about her character. For years, she said nothing. The bullying allegations surfaced, swirled, made headlines, and Samantha Cohen, the most senior aide of all, the one in the best possible position to confirm or deny, stayed silent. She did not rush to a newspaper. She did not cash in. She kept the confidence exactly as her 2 decades of service had trained her to. When she finally did speak, it was years later in an interview with an Australian paper, and even then she was careful almost to the point of frustration. She confirmed the bare facts and very little of the colour. She confirmed that she had been one of around 10 royal staff members questioned during the palace's investigation into the allegations against Meghan. She confirmed the 6 months became 18 ordeal and the recruit who quit in Africa. But she declined to pour out the details, declined to deliver the damning anecdote the press was begging for. She gave just enough to confirm the shape of the thing and not 1 ounce more. And that restraint is its own kind of testimony. A person inventing a grievance overshares. They pile on detail to be believed. A person who actually lived through something difficult and who has spent a lifetime keeping secrets does the opposite. They confirm the fact and guard the rest. Cohen's careful, reluctant, minimal confirmation reads not like a vendetta but like a dignified woman acknowledging at long last that yes, the hard thing was real, while refusing to feed the frenzy around it. She did not need to embellish. The simple fact that she had been interviewed in a formal bullying investigation and that her short assignment had become an inescapable 18 months said plenty. Of course, the sympathetic reading still has its place, and fairness demands we keep giving it room. Perhaps Cohen, for all her poise, simply clashed with a younger, more modern woman who did things differently. Perhaps the famous discretion of the old guard curdled, in Meghan's eyes, into obstruction, a wall of "we don't do it that way" thrown up against every fresh idea. Meghan's defenders would argue that aides like Cohen represented exactly the suffocating, change-resistant culture that drove the Sussexes out in the first place, and that the Duchess's frustration with that culture has been relabeled as cruelty. There is something to that. The clash between a hidebound institution and a reforming newcomer is genuine, and not every grievance flows one way. But notice what the sympathetic reading struggles to explain. It can explain a clash of styles. It cannot easily explain why no one would take the job. It cannot explain why a replacement fled mid-tour. It cannot explain the formal investigation by an outside party, or the careful, costly silence of a woman with nothing to gain. A culture clash produces grumbling and resignations. It does not usually produce an unfillable post and a barrister's inquiry. Samantha Cohen represents the strongest single thread in the case against Meghan, precisely because she was the least likely person to break. She was loyal, experienced, and discreet to a fault. She did not seek the spotlight. She gave the institution every chance. And still she ended up trapped, interviewed by investigators, and eventually, quietly, confirming that the hard thing was real. When your most unshakable witness is shaken, you have to ask what shook them. Which brings us at last to the document at the center of everything. The email that turned whispers into a written record. The complaint that the calmest man in the building felt compelled to send. We have met the receiving end of the 5 a.m. messages. We have met the Queen's own aide who could not escape. Now we read the words that made it official. Before we do, hit that subscribe button, because the next part is the heart of this entire story, and I do not want you to miss where it leads. October 2018. While the public watched a glowing pregnant Duchess charm crowds across Australia and the Pacific, a very different process had begun behind the scenes in London. Jason Knauf, the careful communications secretary we met earlier, sat down and wrote an email that would, years later, become one of the most damaging documents in the modern history of the monarchy. He did not send it to a newspaper. He did not whisper it to a friend. He sent it through the most formal channel available to him, to the private secretary of Prince William, the future king's most senior advisor. This was Knauf using the proper machinery of the institution to raise an alarm he believed could no longer be ignored. And the language he chose was not hedged or softened. It was direct in a way that royal officials almost never permit themselves to be. He wrote that he was very concerned that Meghan was able to bully 2 members of staff out of the household in the past year. Sit with that phrasing. Not that staff had left, not that there had been friction, that she was able to bully 2 people out in a single year, as though describing a pattern he had watched unfold and felt powerless to stop. He went further. He wrote that the treatment of a 3rd staff member, referred to in the leaked version by an initial to protect their identity, was totally unacceptable. He said the Duchess seemed intent on always having someone in her sights. He said she was undermining that person's confidence, and that there had been report after report from people who had witnessed unacceptable behavior toward them. Report after report, that is the phrase to hold on to. Knauf was not describing his own bruised feelings. He was describing a stream of accounts reaching him from multiple people who had seen things they found disturbing. He was the point where many smaller complaints converged, and he was telling the future king's office that the volume had become impossible to dismiss. There was a second layer to his message that in some ways is even more revealing. In a follow-up, Knauf raised the question of whether the institution's own policy on bullying and harassment even applied to members of the royal family. Think about why a person asks that. He asks it because he already suspects the answer is no, that the normal protections every other worker in the building could rely upon simply evaporated when the perpetrator wore a crown. He was flagging not just an individual's conduct but a structural blind spot, a place where the rules ran out and the staff were left exposed. He noted that the palace's head of human resources agreed with him that the situation was very serious. He was not a lone voice. The professional whose entire job was to assess such matters had looked at the same facts and reached the same conclusion. Now, the existence of this email did not become public for years. It sat in the institution's files, unaddressed in any way the public could see, while the Sussex story rolled on through the wedding afterglow, the pregnancy, the birth of Archie, and the slow, visible souring of relations between Harry's household and the rest of the family. The complaint was a buried landmine. It would not detonate until the worst possible moment for Meghan, on the eve of the most important interview of her life. We will get to that explosion. But first, fairness, because this email demands the most careful handling of anything in the story. There are real arguments on the other side, and a responsible telling has to put them as strongly as their advocates would. The first is timing, and it is the argument Meghan's camp has leaned on hardest. The complaint surfaced publicly just days before the Sussex's 2021 Oprah Winfrey interview, a moment when the couple was about to tell the world its own story of mistreatment by the institution. Meghan's supporters argue that this timing was no accident, that someone inside the palace deliberately leaked a years-old, never adjudicated complaint precisely to muddy her credibility before she could speak. If that is true, it does not make the complaint false, but it does mean the complaint was weaponized, used as a shield by an institution bracing for criticism. The leak and the truth of the contents are two separate questions, and you can believe the leak was dirty while still taking the content seriously. The second argument is about adjudication, and it is the strongest one Meghan has. Knauf's email is an allegation. It is a serious, senior, carefully worded allegation, but it was never tested in the way allegations are supposed to be tested. The Duchess never had a formal public chance to answer it point by point, to cross-examine, to present her side before a neutral judge. An accusation, however credible the accuser, is not a verdict. Meghan has consistently and forcefully denied that she bullied anyone, and she is entitled to the weight of that denial. In any fair system, the unanswered charge cannot simply be treated as established fact. The third is context, the human frame we keep returning to. Knauf himself, even as he raised the alarm, was operating inside a household at war with the press and increasingly at war with the rest of the family. Tensions were extraordinary. Everyone was exhausted and frightened and convinced the other side was out to get them. In an atmosphere that toxic behavior gets read in the worst possible light, and a demanding, anxious principal can look like a tyrant to staff who are themselves stretched to breaking. None of that excuses genuine cruelty, but it complicates the simple picture of a villain and her victims. Hold all three of those arguments in your mind because they are real, and then set them beside the thing they cannot dissolve. The complaint exists. It was written by the calmest, most credible person in the building. It was sent through official channels, not leaked by its author. It described not one incident but a pattern, sourced to multiple witnesses, serious enough that the head of HR agreed and concerned enough about the institution's blind spots that Knauf asked whether the rules even applied. And the man who wrote it later helped Meghan in court, which means he cannot be dismissed as an enemy. You can argue about timing, about adjudication, about context. You cannot make the document disappear, so we have the complaint. The question that consumed the palace for the next several years was what to do about it, and the answer they eventually chose, an investigation whose findings were buried so deep they may never see daylight, is a chapter all its own. But before the lawyers and the inquiry, we need to live inside the year that produced this email. We need to understand the wedding-to-tour pressure cooker of 2018, the period when, according to the accounts, the household truly began to crack. Because the complaint did not come from nowhere. It came from a specific, grinding, high-pressure stretch of months, and that is where we go next. If you're finding this useful, the comments are open. Tell me honestly, does Knauf's email move you, or do you think the timing of the leak poisons it? I read them and part 5 is already waiting. The complaint was written in October 2018, which means the behavior it described unfolded across the months before. So let's go there. Let's reconstruct the year that broke the household, the stretch between the fairy tale wedding in May and the Pacific tour in the autumn, when by multiple accounts, the working relationship between Meghan and the people around her went from strained to unsustainable. Start with the wedding itself, because the wedding is where the first casualty fell. Melissa Tubati, the personal assistant who had been central to planning the entire event, was gone within 6 months of pulling it off. We talked about how strange that is, walking away from a triumph at the peak of its success, but place it on the timeline and it becomes a marker. The very first major departure came almost immediately after the wedding, in the earliest phase of Meghan's life as a working royal. Whatever was happening, it was happening fast, and it was happening from the start. The royal wedding, for all its beauty on screen, was reportedly a flashpoint behind the scenes. There were tensions over details large and small, the kind of frictions that any high-stakes event produces, but amplified by the collision of Meghan's Hollywood standards with the palace's centuries of "this is how it is done." There was the now famous episode involving the bridesmaids' dresses, which would later become a he said she said of its own, with competing claims about who reduced whom to tears. Meghan has firmly maintained that the conflict went the other way, that she was the one left in tears, not the cause of anyone else's. The truth of that single afternoon may never be settled, but the fact that a dispute over children's dresses became a years-long battleground tells you how charged the atmosphere already was, before the marriage was even a week old. Then came the working life proper, and with it the rhythm we examined earlier, the early morning messages, the relentless pace, the sense among staff that the standards were impossibly high, and the margin for error non-existent. Royal aides are used to hard work. That is the job. What the accounts describe is something past hard work, a climate in which people felt personally diminished, in which competent professionals began to doubt themselves, in which the dread of getting it wrong outweighed the prestige of the post. By the autumn, the household was in open difficulty. The Africa tour, meant in part to bed in Samantha Cohen's replacement, instead produced another resignation when that replacement quit mid-trip. So picture the actual state of affairs as Knauf composed his email. The personal assistant from the wedding gone. The Queen's own seasoned aide, trapped in a role she had meant to leave months earlier. The intended successor, fled in the middle of a foreign tour. A third staff member by Knauf's account being ground down day by day. This was not one unhappy employee with a grudge. This was a household visibly shedding its most capable people faster than it could replace them, in the span of a single year. What was it actually like inside? The leaked descriptions that later emerged painted staff as feeling sick, terrified, and deeply stressed in their dealings with the Duchess. Those are strong words, and they came through the filter of a complaint, so weigh them as such. But strip them to their core, and you have people describing physical symptoms of workplace fear, the body's response to an environment it has learned to brace against. You do not feel sick before work because your boss is merely demanding. You feel sick before work because you have learned that the day might bring humiliation, and you cannot predict when. Here is where I have to slow down and give the other side its fullest hearing yet, because part 5 is exactly where it would be easy to stack the deck. Everything I have just described is also perfectly consistent with a second story, and that story has serious defenders. In the second story, the pressure cooker was not built by Meghan, it was built around her. Consider what was actually happening to her across that same year. She had married into a family she barely knew, in a country whose customs were alien to her, under a level of press scrutiny that no American actress, however famous, could have been prepared for. The British tabloids had turned on her with a viciousness that many neutral observers found genuinely shocking, running stories that her defenders, and not only her defenders, identified as carrying a racial edge. She was pregnant, she was isolated. The people around her, however professional, were products of an institution that she increasingly felt did not want her and would not protect her. Harry has said as much repeatedly and in detail, describing a family and a system that he believes failed his wife and fed her to the wolves. In that frame, a woman sending anxious messages at dawn is not a tyrant. She is someone drowning, grasping for control over the only thing she can control, the work, because everything else, the press, the family, the protocol, is beyond her reach and closing in. The high standards become the perfectionism of a person terrified of giving her enemies more ammunition. The clashes with old guard aides become the friction of a reformer meeting a wall, and the difficult label becomes once again what the establishment calls a woman who will not be managed. This frame is not a fantasy. Harry's testimony is real and consistent. The press treatment of Meghan was, by any honest measure, often brutal and sometimes worse. The institution's failures of support are documented by the couple's own departure from it. A person can hold all of that as true and still be unsure what to make of the staff complaints, because both things can be true at once. An institution can fail a woman badly, and that woman can also treat her staff badly. Suffering does not confer kindness. Victims can have victims. The two stories are not actually mutually exclusive, which is the single hardest thing about this entire saga to sit with. What the pressure cooker year establishes, then, is not a verdict but a density of events. Too many departures, too fast, too senior, across too short a span, for the simplest innocent explanations to fully cover. Something real happened in the household in 2018. The argument is about its cause, not its existence. And then, having happened, it was filed away. Knauf's complaint went up the chain and into the institution's memory, and for more than 2 years the public knew almost none of it. The story went quiet. The Sussexes had their baby, grew more estranged, and eventually, in early 2020, announced they were stepping back entirely. The buried complaint waited until, on the eve of the most watched interview of Meghan's life, someone dug it up and handed it to a newspaper, and the whole thing exploded into the open. That explosion, the leak, the Oprah interview, and the calculated smear campaign defense that Meghan's team threw up against it, is where we go next. It is the moment the private war became a public one. Subscribe if you haven't, because the next part is where the story stops being a palace secret and becomes a global firestorm. By the start of 2021, Harry and Meghan were no longer working royals. They had stepped back, decamped to California, and signed deals that would make them very rich. And they had agreed to sit down with Oprah Winfrey for a 2-hour interview in which they intended to tell the world, in their own words, how the institution had wronged them. It was set to be one of the most watched television events in years, a carefully staged moment of reckoning in which the couple would be the accusers and the palace the accused. Days before it aired, the story flipped. The Times of London published Jason Knauf's bullying complaint. The buried email, more than 2 years old, suddenly detonated across the front pages. The full scale of the 2018 allegations, the bullying of 2 PAs out of the household, the undermining of a third, the someone in her sights language, all of it that had been sealed inside the institution's files was now public, and the timing could not possibly have been worse for Meghan. On the very eve of her appearance as a victim of the palace, she was recast in the headlines as a perpetrator within it. The placement was too perfect to be coincidence, and almost no one believed it was. Someone had chosen this exact moment to release this exact document, with the obvious intent of blunting the Oprah interview before a word of it was broadcast. This is the strongest card in Meghan's hand, and it is a strong card. Whoever leaked the complaint was not motivated by a pure love of truth. They were running a counter-operation, using a years-old, never publicly tested allegation as a preemptive strike. The cynicism of that act is real, and it deserves to be named plainly. An institution that had spent years declining to address the complaint through any visible process suddenly found it extremely useful to have it in the papers the week Meghan was about to embarrass them. Meghan's team responded with fury, and with a phrase that would define her defense from that day forward. They called it a calculated smear campaign based on misleading and harmful misinformation. They framed the leak not as the surfacing of an inconvenient truth, but as the latest move in a long effort to destroy her, to discredit her before she could speak, to paint the victim as the villain. It was, they argued, exactly the kind of orchestrated character assassination the couple was about to describe to Oprah, proof of the very machine they were fleeing. And then the interview aired, and it was devastating, in the opposite direction. Meghan told Oprah she had felt suicidal and been denied help. The couple alleged that a member of the family had raised concerns about how dark their unborn child's skin might be. Harry described a family and an institution that had abandoned them, controlled them, and refused to defend them against a racist press. Whatever you think of the bullying allegations, the Oprah interview landed real, serious, painful charges against the palace, and millions of viewers came away convinced that Meghan was the wronged party and the monarchy the cold, even cruel machine that had broken her. So now you have 2 stories colliding in real time, in the same news cycle, each undercutting the other. In one, Meghan is a bully whose victims were finally being heard. In the other, Meghan is a victim whose abusers were smearing her to save themselves. And the maddening thing, the thing that makes this saga endure, is that the evidence does not force you to choose. The leak can be dirty and the complaint can be true. The palace can have wronged Meghan and Meghan can have wronged her staff. Both interviews, Knauf's written one and Meghan's televised one, can be describing something real. Let's test the calculated smear campaign defense honestly, because it is the load-bearing wall of Meghan's entire case, and it deserves rigorous examination rather than either easy acceptance or easy dismissal. The defense is strong on the leak and weak on the substance, and it is important to separate those. On the leak, Meghan is almost certainly right. The release was timed, strategic, and hostile. As an account of why the document came out when it did, smear campaign is persuasive. But notice what the phrase quietly tries to do. It attacks the timing and the motive of the messenger in order to discredit the contents of the message. And those are different things. A true complaint can be leaked for cynical reasons. The dirtiness of the leak tells you about the leaker. It tells you nothing about whether the staff who said they were bullied actually were. And here the defense runs into the wall it can never get past. The same wall we hit in part 4. Jason Knauf. If this were truly a calculated smear campaign, a coordinated effort by enemies to destroy Meghan with fabricated charges, then the author of the central document would have to be one of those enemies. But he was not. He was the man who, around the same period, gave evidence that helped Meghan win her court case against a newspaper. The architect of the supposed smear was also a witness for her defense. That is not how smear campaigns work. You do not assist your target in litigation while secretly manufacturing lies to ruin her. The presence of Knauf at the center of both the complaint and Meghan's legal victory breaks the smear theory in half. It means the complaint cannot be reduced to malice, because its author demonstrably also acted in Meghan's interest. So the most honest reading of the firestorm is this: the leak was a hostile act, probably orchestrated, and Meghan is right to be angry about how and when the complaint surfaced. But the complaint itself was not a fabrication, because the person who wrote it was not her enemy. The smear campaign defense successfully indicts the leaker and fails to exonerate the accused. It answers the question of who released the document and dodges the question of whether the document is true. Faced with this mess, the palace did something that in retrospect looks less like a search for truth and more like an attempt to make the whole thing disappear. They commissioned an investigation, an external law firm, a formal inquiry privately funded by the Queen herself. Around 10 staff members, including Samantha Cohen, would be interviewed. It had all the trappings of accountability. And then, when it was done, they buried the results so thoroughly that, by every indication, they will never be released. Why an institution would investigate bullying and then hide what it found, and what that silence actually tells us, is the question at the heart of the next part. Hit subscribe, because the cover-up, if that's what it was, is in some ways the most revealing chapter of all. When the bullying allegations exploded into public view in March 2021, the palace faced a choice. It could ignore them, which was no longer possible now that they were on every front page. It could defend Meghan outright, which would mean taking a position on contested facts, or it could investigate, which is what institutions do when they want to look responsible. The palace chose to investigate. What it did with the results is the part that should trouble everyone, regardless of which side they are on. The inquiry was set up quickly. An external independent law firm was brought in, the standard move for an organization that wants its findings to carry the weight of impartiality. The whole thing was privately funded by Queen Elizabeth, a detail worth pausing on, because it meant the monarch herself was paying to discover the truth about her grandson's wife. Around 10 members of staff were interviewed, the people best placed to know what had actually happened inside the household between 2018 and 2020. Among them was Samantha Cohen, the Queen's own former aide, whose careful confirmation years later told us she had been part of this very process. This was not a token gesture. Interviewing 10 witnesses through an outside firm is a serious undertaking. Someone wanted to know. The machinery of a genuine investigation was assembled and set in motion, and it ran its course. The inquiry began in 2021 and concluded the following year, and then the findings disappeared. The palace announced that the investigation was complete, and that lessons had been learned, and that changes had been made to its HR policies as a result. But it would not say what the investigation had actually found. It would not publish the report. A senior royal aide indicated, in language that has never been walked back, that the findings would not be made public, with no sign that they ever will be. The conclusions of a formal, externally conducted monarch-funded inquiry into the conduct of a member of the royal family were sealed, and as far as the public record shows, sealed for good. Now the institution's defenders will say there are perfectly ordinary reasons for that. Employment matters are confidential. The privacy of the staff who came forward had to be protected. Publishing the findings could have exposed vulnerable witnesses to a media feeding frenzy. These are legitimate concerns, and a responsible account has to grant them. There genuinely are good faith reasons not to splash the details of a workplace investigation across the newspapers, and the welfare of the complainants is one of them. But notice the shape of what the palace actually said, because the shape is everything. They said the investigation led to changes in their bullying and harassment policies. Think hard about that. You do not overhaul your anti-bullying procedures because an inquiry found that no bullying occurred. You overhaul them because something in the findings persuaded you that your existing protections had failed. The very admission that policies were changed is a quiet, oblique acknowledgement that the investigation found a problem worth fixing. If Meghan had been cleared the cleanest possible outcome for an institution desperate to move on, there would be nothing to reform and every reason to say so loudly. Instead, they reformed quietly and said nothing about the verdict. That asymmetry speaks. Consider the two possible explanations for the silence, and weigh which one fits the behavior. If the investigation had exonerated Meghan, the palace would have had every incentive to say so. A clear finding of no bullying occurred would have ended the story, protected the duchess, spared the family further damage, and cost nothing. Institutions do not sit on good news about their own members. The fact that they did not announce an exoneration is by itself strong circumstantial evidence that there was no exoneration to announce. If the investigation had found against Meghan, on the other hand, the palace would face an impossible bind. Publishing a finding that a member of the royal family had bullied staff would be catastrophic, a permanent official on-the-record stain that could never be removed and that would define her forever. It would also, given that the family was by then trying to manage a delicate and very public estrangement, pour fuel on a fire they were desperate to contain. Far easier to quietly change the policies, murmur about lessons learned, and lock the report in a drawer. The burial is exactly what you would expect if the findings were damaging and the institution wanted to avoid both a lie and a bombshell. That second explanation fits the observed facts better than the first. It is not proof. The report's contents remain genuinely unknown, and intellectual honesty requires admitting that we are reading the silence rather than the document. But the silence has a texture. An institution that found nothing tends to say so. An institution that changes its rules while refusing to explain why is behaving like one that found something it cannot afford to confirm. And here the people who paid the price slide back into focus, because the burial did them a specific wrong. The staff who came forward, who sat for interviews with an outside law firm, who relived whatever they had experienced in the hope that the institution would finally take it seriously, got nothing they could point to. No public finding, no vindication, no official acknowledgement that what they described was real. Their testimony was gathered, weighed in secret, and then locked away, leaving them in a permanent limbo, unable even to say that they had been believed. Whatever the report concluded, the women around Meghan were asked to bear their experiences and were then handed silence in return. The institution protected itself first, as institutions do, and the people it had failed to protect in 2018 were failed a second time in 2022, when their truth, whatever it was sealed away to keep the peace. So the investigation that was supposed to settle the question instead entombed it. We are left with a complaint we can read, a process we know happened, an outcome we will never see, and a policy change that hints at what the outcome was. That is the strange, unsatisfying core of this story. The most authoritative inquiry into the matter exists, and its verdict is a locked box. But the story does not end with the locked box, because Meghan's life did not end with her departure from royal duty. She and Harry built something new in California, an organization, a brand, a fresh start meant to leave all the old toxicity behind. And a remarkable thing happened there. The same pattern began again, the same revolving door, the same flood of departures. Far from the palace, far from the hostile press and the resentful courtiers, in a household of her own making, the staff kept leaving. That is where we go next, to Montecito, and to the survivors who gave themselves a name. Subscribe, because what happened in California is the part of the story that makes it impossible to blame the institution alone. Here is the test that matters most, and it is the reason this story cannot be waved away as simply the establishment crushing an outsider. Because Meghan left the establishment, she walked away from the rigid protocols, the resentful courtiers, the hostile British press, all of it. She and Harry built a new life in Montecito, California, on their own terms, with their own organization and their own hand-picked staff, answerable to no palace and bound by no centuries-old rules. If the difficulties of 2018 were truly the product of a cold institution that would not accept her, then in California, free of that institution, the difficulties should have ended. They did not end. They followed her across the ocean. The departures in America have been relentless and by now almost numbing in their regularity. A roll call gives the scale of it. The couple's longtime talent agent left. A close friend who worked with them left. Senior executives at their Archerwell Foundation left, including people brought in with great fanfare to give the operation credibility. Their first chief of staff in California lasted, by some accounts, only a matter of months before quitting, reportedly uncomfortable with aspects of the job. Communications chiefs came and went. Press secretaries came and went. The pattern that had defined the Kensington Palace years reasserted itself in the California sunshine, in an environment Meghan herself controlled, and the staff, the former staff, gave the pattern a name. They began half-jokingly and half-not to call themselves the Sussex Survivors Club. Survivors. Not former employees, not alumni, but survivors, the word people use for those who have come through something harmful and lived. Some of them, according to reporting, only half-jokingly described feeling as though they suffered a form of post-traumatic stress from their time working for the couple. That is dark humor, the gallows kind, the kind that people reach for when the real feeling underneath is too heavy to say straight. You do not call yourself a survivor of a job that was merely demanding. The name itself is a verdict, delivered collectively by people who had nothing to gain from coining it. The descriptions that filtered out of Montecito were, if anything, harsher than the British ones. One account given to The Hollywood Reporter had a source saying that everyone was terrified of Meghan. Another described her as absolutely relentless. The most brutal of them painted her marching around issuing orders and claimed the speaker had watched her reduce grown men to tears. These are anonymous, and anonymous claims are the cheapest currency in celebrity reporting, so they cannot be treated as established fact. But here is what gives them weight beyond their anonymity. They echo almost exactly what was said in London years earlier by entirely different people. The 5 a.m. emails of Kensington Palace become the relentless taskmaster of Montecito. The staff reduced to tears in 2018 become the grown men reduced to tears in California. The same shape, the same complaints, the same revolving door, on two continents separated by years and an ocean, from sources who could not have coordinated. This is the fact that the sympathetic interpretation cannot fully absorb. The institution-blaming frame, which is genuinely powerful for the royal years, requires the institution to be the cause. Remove the institution and the frame predicts the problem should ease. Instead, the problem persisted in a setting purpose-built to be everything the palace was not. You can blame Buckingham Palace for 2018. You cannot blame Buckingham Palace for a chief of staff quitting a private foundation in Santa Barbara in 2024. At some point, when the only constant across every version of the workplace is one person, honest analysis has to at least consider that the constant is relevant. I will still give the counter-argument its due, because it has not vanished entirely. Defenders point out that high-profile, high-pressure principles often churn through staff, that demanding bosses are common in entertainment and politics, that building a new organization from scratch is chaotic and produces turnover for reasons that have nothing to do with cruelty. They note that the British tabloid ecosystem did not stop hunting Meghan when she moved, that hostile briefings continued to flow across the Atlantic, and that some of the terrified staff stories may themselves be products of that ongoing campaign. They argue that a successful, ambitious woman running a media empire will inevitably be called difficult by people who could not keep up. All of that is fair, and some of it is surely true in individual cases. Not every Montecito departure is evidence of anything, but the sheer accumulation strains those explanations past their limit. One chief of staff quitting fast is chaos, a talent agent leaving is business, an executive moving on is a career. But when you line up the agents and the executives and the chiefs of staff and the press secretaries and the communications directors year after year, and you set that line beside the identical line from the royal years, and you notice that the former staff have collectively named themselves survivors, the "it's just turnover" explanation begins to look like a refusal to see a pattern that is sitting in plain sight. At some point, the kindest thing you can say is that Meghan is extraordinarily, consistently, cross-continentally unlucky in her employees. The less kind thing is the obvious thing, and the people who paid the price kept paying it. Each name on that list is a person who took a job working for one of the most famous women in the world, who presumably arrived excited, and who left, often quickly, often unhappily, sometimes describing genuine distress. The agents and executives and assistants of Montecito joined the PAs and private secretaries of Kensington Palace in a single long line of careers that intersected with Meghan's and came out altered. That is the through line of this entire story, not the headlines about Meghan. The people around Meghan in London and in California who kept leaving. The departures did not stop in the past, they continued right up to the present into the most recent stretch of the Archewell operation in a wave of exits that suggests the pattern is not history but ongoing reality. That recent exodus and what it tells us about whether anything has changed is where we turn next. If you've made it this far, you're the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Subscribe and let's finish the story. If the Montecito departures had tapered off, if the revolving door had finally slowed as the operation matured, you could argue the early chaos was just the friction of building something new, but the door did not slow. It kept spinning, right into the most recent chapters of the Sussex story, in a pattern so persistent that royal commentators have stopped treating each exit as news and started treating the exits collectively as a permanent condition. The recent run is striking. Across 2025, the couple's communications operation hemorrhaged people. Several communications staffers resigned in the same stretch, a clustering that is hard to read as coincidence. A global press secretary who had spent a couple of years with the couple stepped away to start her own agency. Then, as the year closed, two of the most senior figures went almost at once. The couple's chief communications officer, who had only started in the role months earlier in the spring, announced she was stepping down. Within days, a longtime advisor, one of the rare figures who had been with the operation for years and served as an executive director at Archewell, announced his own departure. Two senior people gone within a week, one of them barely arrived, the other a veteran who had stuck it out longer than almost anyone. That combination is the tell. When a brand new senior hire and a long-serving loyalist exit in the same few days, you are not looking at ordinary career movement. You are looking at an organization that cannot retain either fresh talent or institutional memory, that loses the people who just got there, and the people who have been there forever, simultaneously. Royal watchers noted that in comparable roles elsewhere, people typically stay 3 to 5 years, and that the usual reasons for leaving are mergers, scandals, or a change of leadership, the exceptions being startups and organizations in crisis. The Sussex operation fit the crisis profile, not the stable one. The reporting around these departures revived the old language because the people writing it could not avoid the obvious echo. The phrase Sussex Survivors Club resurfaced, explicitly tied back to the bullying allegations of the royal years, the through line drawn in black and white by commentators who pointed out that the trauma the former palace staff had described was now rhyming again with the experience of the California staff. Each new wave of exits dragged the whole history back into view, because each new wave looked so much like the last. There was a particular sting to one of the most recent senior departures, noted by those who cover the couple closely. Of all the exits over the years, and there had been so many, one observer suggested this one would hit the hardest, a sign that the loss of stability had reached even the figures the couple most depended on. The couple, for their part, continued to present Archewell as evolving and purposeful, an organization growing into its mission, but the framing had grown defensive. Instead of the story being about the foundation's work, the story had become about the people who kept leaving the foundation, and no amount of mission statement language could pull the spotlight back. The departures had become the narrative. Now fairness one more time, because it matters most precisely when the pattern looks most damning. There are real, non-sinister reasons organizations lose staff in clusters. Restructuring causes waves of exits. Strategic pivots make some roles redundant. A small organization that changes direction, as Archewell has more than once, will shed the people hired for the old direction. Communications professionals in particular move frequently, chasing better titles and bigger platforms. The press secretary who left to found her own agency is doing exactly what ambitious people in that field do. Some of these departures are genuinely ordinary, and it would be dishonest to assign dark meaning to every single one. People leave jobs. It happens everywhere. And yet, the defense that works for any individual departure works less and less well as the departures accumulate into a years-long two-continent pattern that everyone covering it can see. You can explain the press secretary, you can explain the restructuring. What you cannot easily explain is why this particular operation, across every iteration in every location under every strategy, with both veterans and newcomers, keeps producing the same result at a rate that draws constant comment. The individual explanations are each plausible. The aggregate is what demands attention, and the aggregate by now is overwhelming. This is also where the practical consequence comes into view, the thing that turns a reputation into a problem with teeth. Royal and PR commentators have begun to warn that the turnover itself may now limit the couple's future. Word travels in small professional worlds. Communications and executive talent talk to one another, and a reputation as an impossible place to work eventually reaches the very people you most need to hire. An organization that burns through senior staff at this rate starts to struggle to attract replacements of the same caliber because the best people have options and choose stability. The revolving door, in other words, may be starting to cost the couple not just the staff who leave, but the staff they can no longer get. The reputation built across all those departures has become a barrier of its own. So we arrive, finally, at the full shape of the thing. Not one bad year at Kensington Palace, explainable by a hostile institution. Not one rough patch in California, explainable by the chaos of a startup, but a continuous, documented, decade-long pattern spanning the royal household and the private foundation, surviving the move across the Atlantic, persisting through every change of strategy and structure, and consistent enough that the people who lived through it gave themselves a collective name, and the people who report on it have run out of fresh ways to describe it. What do we do with a pattern like that? How do we weigh it honestly, holding on to everything true in Meghan's defense while refusing to look away from what the record shows? That final reckoning, the attempt to say what this all actually means without pretending to a certainty we do not have, is where we end. One last subscribe before the conclusion, because the final part is where we put it all together. We have come a long way, and I am not going to insult you now by pretending the evidence delivers a clean verdict. It does not. What it delivers is a pattern, and a pattern is a different thing from a proof. So let me lay out as plainly and fairly as I can what we actually know, what we genuinely do not, and what the honest weight of it all comes to. Start with what we do not know, because intellectual honesty demands it go first. We do not know what the Palace investigation found because its conclusions were sealed and may never be released. We have never seen Meghan formally answer the bullying allegations point by point in any neutral forum because no such forum was ever convened. Many of the harshest descriptions, especially the California ones, are anonymous, and anonymous claims can be exaggerated, recycled, or planted. The bridesmaid dress dispute remains a genuine he said, she said that may never be resolved, and the leak that brought the whole thing into public view was by every indication a hostile and calculated act, which means we should be suspicious of the motives of whoever staged it. All of that is real, and anyone who tells this story while hiding it is selling you something. Now hold the strongest version of Meghan's defense in full, because it has earned a fair hearing and not a grudging one. She was an outsider dropped into the most rigid institution in the Western world, an institution that by her husband's detailed and consistent testimony contained people who resented her, briefed against her, and failed to protect her. The British press treatment of her was by any honest measure frequently brutal and carried an edge that many neutral observers identified as racial. She was isolated, pregnant, and unsupported during the worst of it. The label difficult has been pinned on ambitious women since the beginning of time, and the same drive that gets a man called a strong leader gets a woman called a tyrant, and suffering is real even when it is not the whole story. The Oprah interview leveled serious charges that deserve to be taken seriously on their own terms. Every one of these points is true. None of them should be minimized to make the story tidier. And now, against that, the thing the defense cannot dissolve. There is a pattern, and the pattern has features that the institution-blaming frame cannot fully absorb. The complaint was written by Jason Knauf, the calmest and most credible figure in the building, through official channels not leaked by him, describing not one incident but a stream of them sourced to multiple witnesses, serious enough that the head of HR agreed and structural enough that he asked whether the rules even applied to royals. And the man who wrote it later helped Meghan win in court, which means he cannot be filed under enemy and dismissed. The most unshakable witness, Samantha Cohen, the Queen's own aide, loyal and discreet to a fault, was trapped in a 6-month job for 18 months because no one would replace her, was interviewed in the formal investigation and eventually, carefully confirmed the hard thing was real without ever cashing in. The investigation that should have settled it was conducted by an outside firm, funded by the Queen, drew on around 10 witnesses and then produced not an exoneration but a quiet change to the institution's anti-bullying policies and a permanent seal on its findings, which is not how institutions behave when they have found nothing. And then the move to California, which should have been the controlled experiment that cleared everything up, removed the cold institution, and the difficulties should ease. Instead, they continued, on a new continent, in a household Meghan herself built and controlled, right up to the present, with senior staff still leaving in clusters years later, and the former employees calling themselves survivors. Set those 4 things side by side and notice what they have in common. They cannot all be explained by the palace because 2 of them happened outside the palace or against the palace's own interest. The institution-blaming frame is genuinely powerful for the events of 2018. It has nothing to say about a chief of staff quitting a Santa Barbara foundation in 2024, or about why the Queen's own aide could not be replaced, or about why the architect of the central complaint also aided Meghan's defense. When you account for everything the frame cannot reach, you are left with one element that is present in every version of the story, in every location, across every year. And honest analysis, which refuses to let either side off the hook, has to at least name that element rather than pretend it isn't there. So here is where I land, and I want to be precise about the strength of the claim, because precision is the whole point. I cannot tell you that Meghan Markle is a bully, because that word implies a settled finding that no neutral process ever delivered, and I will not hand you a certainty I do not possess. What I can tell you is that the evidence for a serious, persistent problem in how she ran her households is far stronger, far better sourced, and far harder to dismiss than her defenders have ever been willing to admit, and that the single explanation which fits all of the facts, the royal years and the California years and the credibility of Knauf and the silence of the report, is not the one in which she is purely a victim. The smear campaign defense successfully indicts the people who leaked the complaint. It never managed to answer the complaint, and through all of it return one last time to the people this was actually about, because they are the reason the story matters and the part the headlines always forget. The personal assistant who left the wedding she had built, the Queen's aide who could not get free, the third staffer, named only by an initial, said to have had someone always in her sights, the grown professionals in California who called themselves survivors, the chiefs of staff and press secretaries and executives whose careers intersected with Meghan's and came out altered. They did not seek fame. Most of them never spoke publicly, and the ones who did spoke carefully, years late, and got no public vindication in return. Their experiences were gathered, weighed in secret and locked away to keep the peace. Whatever the sealed report concluded, the women around Meghan were asked to relive the worst of it and were handed silence as their reward. That is the cost the title points to. Not the cost to Meghan, who remains rich, famous, and surrounded by a public that adores her. The cost to them, the ones whose names you do not know, who took the dream job and left it diminished, and who are still in the small professional world they came from, remembered as the Sussex Survivors Club. You have now seen everything I have. The strongest case for her and the hardest facts against her, laid side by side. I have given you my honest read, but the verdict was never mine to deliver. It is yours. So tell me in the comments where you have landed after all of it. The target, or the tyrant, or, as the evidence may finally suggest, the uncomfortable possibility that an institution can fail a woman badly, and that woman can still have failed the people who worked for her, both at once. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If this is the kind of careful, evidence-first storytelling you want more of, subscribing is the single thing that keeps it coming, and it costs you nothing at all. I will see you in the next one. We have spent a great deal of time on the staff, on the assistants and secretaries who came and went, but there is one woman whose clash with Meghan became more famous than all of them combined, and she was not staff at all. She was family. She was the future Princess of Wales. And the story of what happened between Meghan Markle and Kate Middleton in the days before the royal wedding is the single most contested episode in this entire saga, because for once, both women were too powerful to be silenced, and the result is a genuine collision of accounts that has never fully resolved. Here is what is not in dispute. In the run-up to the May 2018 wedding, there was a serious disagreement between the two duchesses over the bridesmaid dresses, specifically the dress to be worn by Kate's daughter, Princess Charlotte, who was then not quite 3 years old. The disagreement was sharp enough that someone ended up in tears. That much every version agrees on. What every version does not agree on is who cried, who caused it, and what it revealed about each woman. The original story, the one that ran in the British press in late 2018, was unambiguous and damaging to Meghan. It reported flatly that Meghan had made Kate cry. The framing was that during a stressful fitting for Charlotte's dress, Meghan made demands, the atmosphere turned hostile, and Kate left the encounter sobbing. A source told the papers that demands were made about the timing of subsequent fittings, and that Kate left in tears. The detail that gave the story its sticking power was the claim that the rift had begun over royal protocol, that Kate had said the bridesmaids should wear tights in keeping with royal convention, and that Meghan had disagreed. In that telling, the story was a perfect miniature of everything the Duchess' difficult narrative wanted to say: the brash American steamrolling the gentle, protocol-respecting English Rose, reducing a new mother to tears over a toddler's dress. For nearly 3 years, that was the version the public knew. Meghan made Kate cry. It hardened into accepted fact, repeated endlessly, one of the foundational stones of Meghan's negative reputation. Then, in March 2021, sitting across from Oprah Winfrey in front of tens of millions of viewers, Meghan detonated it. She said simply that the reverse had happened, not that there had been no incident, but that the direction of the story was upside down. It was not she who made Kate cry. It was Kate who made her cry. Meghan said the narrative of a long-standing feud born from that fitting simply did not happen the way it had been told. She said that Kate had hurt her feelings, and in a detail that landed like a slap, she added that Kate had later apologized and taken accountability, even sending her flowers. Meghan's point was not just to flip the story but to use it as evidence of something larger, that the press, fed by the institution, had been willing to print a damaging falsehood about her and let it stand for years, precisely because it fit the villain role they had cast her in. This was an extraordinary moment, and it is worth dwelling on why. A widely accepted story about Meghan, one that had done real damage to her image, turned out, by her account, to be not just exaggerated but reversed. If she was telling the truth, it was a powerful vindication of her central claim that she was the target of a campaign of distortion. The bridesmaid story became, in her hands, Exhibit A for the smear. Then Harry added his own version, and here is where it gets genuinely complicated, because Harry's account in his 2023 memoir does not perfectly match either of the first two. By Harry's telling, the trouble started with a text. 4 days before the wedding, Kate texted Meghan to say that Charlotte's dress was too big, too long, and too baggy, and that Charlotte had cried when she tried it on at home. Meghan, by Harry's account, suggested Kate take the dress to the tailor who was standing by at Kensington Palace. There was a back and forth, tense and escalating, with Meghan pointing out in Harry's version that she was dealing with the enormous stress of her own father at that very moment, her father who was in the middle of a media scandal that would see him miss the wedding entirely. And the upshot, Harry wrote, was that he later found Meghan on the floor, sobbing, distraught over the exchange. He said he was horrified to see her so upset but did not at the time think it was a catastrophe. So now we have three accounts. The original press version, Meghan made Kate cry. Meghan's version, Kate made me cry, and later apologized. Harry's version, there was a fraught exchange over a text about the dress, and Meghan ended up sobbing on the floor. Notice that Meghan's and Harry's accounts agree on the crucial point that Meghan was the one who cried, while differing on the texture, and notice that all three agree that the dispute was real and serious and centered on Charlotte's dress. And then, in 2025, a fourth account arrived, and it may be the most believable of all precisely because it satisfies no one. The royal author Tom Quinn, in a book drawing on accounts from royal servants, reported that a staff member who had knowledge of the incident said that everyone had gotten it wrong, that the truth was that both women were crying their eyes out. According to this staffer, the reality was the most human thing imaginable. During the discussions about the dress, Meghan said a few things she later regretted, and Kate said a few things she later regretted, and it was all in the heat of a high-pressure moment, and both women ended up upset. Not a villain and a victim, two stressed women, days before an enormous public event, one of them a new mother of an infant son, the other managing the implosion of her own family in front of the world, snapping at each other over a child's dress and both walking away hurt. This fourth account deserves real weight because it is the only one that explains why the story has been told so differently by people with no reason to lie. If both women cried, then the original press version, Meghan made Kate cry, was true but partial, capturing only half the room. And Meghan's Oprah version, Kate made me cry, was also true but partial, capturing the other half. Each side told the part that favored them, and each was telling something real. The press chose to print only the half that made Meghan the villain, which is exactly the kind of selective framing Meghan has always complained about, and which would make her grievance legitimate even if her own account was also incomplete. So what does the bridesmaid saga actually tell us, stripped of the spin from every direction? It tells us, first, that Meghan was capable of conflict sharp enough to leave a future queen in tears, because even the most Meghan-friendly accounts concede that Kate was upset and that words were exchanged that needed apologizing for. It tells us, second, that the press genuinely did distort the story against her, printing one half as the whole truth, which validates a real part of her complaint about her treatment. And it tells us, third and most importantly for our purposes, that the pattern we have been tracing of friction and conflict and people ending up in tears around Meghan appears even here, in a dispute with the one woman in the family who was her structural equal. This was not a vulnerable junior assistant who could be bullied. This was the future Princess of Wales, and still the encounter ended in tears and regretted words and a lasting rift. There is one more layer to the bridesmaid story that matters enormously, because it shows the dispute was not a one-off but the beginning of something. Royal commentators have described this clash as the beginning of the end, the first crack in what might have been a close relationship between the two couples. Kate, by several accounts, had genuinely tried to build a friendship, reportedly making efforts to arrange social outings, inviting Meghan to things, attempting to be the welcoming sister-in-law. Whatever happened in that fitting room and around that text exchange, it poisoned the well early. The two women never recovered the easy closeness that the public and perhaps Kate herself had hoped for. But the bridesmaid dispute, for all its fame, was ultimately a private family matter that became public. The thing that turned the private war truly nuclear, that took Meghan from a difficult sister-in-law to a figure accusing the monarchy itself of racism on global television, was the Oprah interview. And the specific claims made in that interview, and the cold, surgical 59 words with which the late Queen responded, are where we go next. Because the palace's reply to Meghan's most explosive accusations contained a single phrase that has become as famous as anything Meghan said, and the story of how that phrase came to be written reveals exactly how the institution decided to fight back. If you want to understand how a family at war chooses its words, stay with me and subscribe so the next part finds you. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. On the 7th of March 2021, the interview aired in the United States, and the monarchy's worst week in a generation began. Over 2 hours, Harry and Meghan laid out a series of allegations against the royal family so serious that they reshaped the institution's global image overnight. To understand the war over Meghan's reputation, you have to understand exactly what was claimed and exactly how the palace chose to answer, because the answer was a masterclass in cold institutional warfare compressed into a single sentence. The claims came in waves. Meghan said that during her time as a working royal she had felt suicidal, that she had gone to the institution asking for help and been denied it, told that it would not be good for the family. She described a feeling of being trapped, silenced, and unprotected. She said her passport, her keys, her freedom had effectively been taken. She described the press intrusion as unbearable, and the institution's refusal to defend her against it as a betrayal. But the single most explosive claim, the one that turned a story about an unhappy duchess into a story about racism at the heart of the British monarchy, was this. Meghan said that while she was pregnant with Archie, there had been conversations within the family about how dark his skin might be when he was born, and what that would mean. She framed it as a concern, raised by an unnamed family member, about the skin color of her future child. Oprah's visible shock became the image of the interview. The implication was incendiary, that a member of the royal family had expressed something like racial anxiety about a mixed-race baby who would be its own blood. Harry, for his part, confirmed and expanded the picture. He described a family that had cut him off financially, that had failed to protect his wife, that was trapped in its own fear of the tabloid press. He spoke of a ruptured relationship with his father and brother. He did, importantly, later clarify one crucial point, that the person who raised the question about Archie's skin was neither his grandmother the Queen, nor his grandfather Prince Philip. But he declined then and since to name who it was, leaving the accusation hanging over the entire family like a fog. The interview was a thermonuclear event. It aired in Britain the following night, and the country and much of the world waited to see how the monarchy would respond. For a day and a half there was nothing. Silence from Buckingham Palace. The pressure built. Commentators speculated that the institution had been so wounded it did not know what to say. The silence was not paralysis, it was deliberation, and it was strategic. The late Queen, by later accounts, was adamant that she would not respond until the interview had actually aired in the United Kingdom, so that she could watch it as the British public watched it, and respond to what the country had actually seen rather than to American headlines. This was old-fashioned institutional discipline. Do not react to the echo, react to the event, and only once you and your subjects are looking at the same thing. And then, 36 hours after the interview first aired, the palace released its response. It was 59 words long. It is worth understanding the precise architecture of those 59 words, because every clause was load-bearing. The statement said the whole family was saddened to learn the full extent of how challenging the last few years had been for Harry and Meghan. That was the olive branch, the expression of family feeling. It said the issues raised, particularly that of race, were concerning. That was the acknowledgement, the refusal to simply dismiss the gravest charge. It said the matters would be taken very seriously and addressed by the family privately. That was the deflection, the closing of the door, the signal that this would not be litigated in public. And it ended by saying that Harry, Meghan and Archie would always be much-loved family members. That was the door left ajar, the assertion of continued belonging. But buried in the middle of that careful conciliatory statement was the dagger. 4 words. While some recollections may vary, sit with the precision of that phrase. It is the most English sentence imaginable, all surface politeness and buried steel. It does not call Meghan a liar. It does not deny the racism allegation outright, which would have been catastrophic and unprovable. What it does is far more surgical. It says in the gentlest possible register that the family does not accept Meghan and Harry's account as the definitive truth. It plants a flag of disagreement without firing a shot. It tells the world that there is another version, and that the family stands by it, while never stooping to argue the details. It is a refusal to concede the narrative, delivered with a smile. And here is the detail that reveals how consciously this was wielded as a weapon. The phrase was not an accident, and it was not casual. By the later account of the royal correspondent Valentine Lowe, the same journalist who had broken the bullying story, the drafting of the palace's response was the subject of intense internal debate. There was a real argument inside the institution about whether to rise entirely above the interview, offering only the olive branch of family feeling, or whether to push back and signal disagreement. According to Lowe's reporting, it was William and Kate who wanted the statement toughened, who insisted it needed to convey that the family did not accept much of what had been said. The phrase "recollections may vary" was reportedly proposed by William's private secretary, and when there was hesitation about including it, out of fear it would inflame Harry and Meghan further, it was Kate by this account who insisted it stay in, reportedly making the point that history would judge the statement and that without that line the family would be seen as having accepted the entire account. Think about what that reveals. The woman at the center of the bridesmaid dispute, the one Meghan had just accused on global television of making her cry, was, by this account, the one who fought hardest to ensure the family's response contained its note of steel. Kate, the supposedly gentle English Rose, was the one pushing for the institution to hold its line. Whether you read that as cold or as principled depends entirely on which sister-in-law you believe, but it tells you the family had decided, at the highest level, that it would not simply absorb Meghan's account in silence. Now, fairness, because this part demands it as much as any. The palace's response, however masterful as institutional craft, can be read two ways, and Meghan's defenders read it as damning. To them, recollections may vary was the institution doing exactly what Meghan accused it of, closing ranks, protecting itself, subtly undermining a woman who had just described feeling suicidal and unprotected. From this angle, the cold precision of the phrase is not admirable, it is chilling. A young woman tells the world she contemplated ending her life inside their care, and the institution's considered response after 36 hours of deliberation includes a polite note that it does not quite believe her. Meghan and Harry, by later accounts, were not surprised by the response, and people close to them said it confirmed their sense that full accountability would never be taken. In their reading, the statement proved the point of the entire interview. There is real force in that reading, and it should not be brushed aside. The racism allegation in particular was never resolved, and the family's refusal to address it publicly, combined with the refusal of Harry and Meghan to name the individual, left it as a permanent open wound that has damaged everyone and clarified nothing. Both sides chose silence over resolution, and both bear some responsibility for the fog that resulted. But notice once again what the recollections may vary saga tells us about the broader question we are tracing. It tells us that the institution faced with Meghan's account did not believe all of it. Not in a tabloid, not through an anonymous brief, but at the highest level, in the most carefully considered statement the monarchy had issued in years, the family signaled, collectively and deliberately, that Meghan's version of events was not one they accepted as true. That is not proof that Meghan was wrong. The family had every motive to protect itself, but it is one more data point in a pattern where the people around Meghan, the staff, the Queen's aide, the investigators, and now the senior members of the family themselves, kept arriving at a version of events that differed sharply from her own, and the gap between Meghan's account and the documented record was about to become something far more concrete than a difference of recollection. Because later that same year, in a courtroom in London, in a case Meghan herself had brought and would actually win, that gap would be exposed in a way that could not be waved away as institutional bias or tabloid malice. It would be exposed by documents, by Meghan's own emails, and it would force her to do something she had never done before, apologize to a court for what it had been told. That courtroom, and the aide who put those documents before the judges, is where we go next. Subscribe, because the next part is where the question of Meghan's credibility stops being a matter of opinion and starts being a matter of record. For everything we have discussed, the staff complaints, the bridesmaid dispute, the Oprah claims, there has always been an escape hatch for Meghan's defenders, and it is a fair one. All of it, they can say, is contested. Anonymous sources, institutional enemies, a hostile press, leaked complaints that were never tested in court. Where, they ask, is the hard proof, the thing that cannot be dismissed as briefing and spin? The answer, uncomfortably, is in a case that Meghan brought herself, and won. Because the most concrete, documented, judicially examined evidence that Meghan's public account did not always match the paper trail did not come from her enemies. It came out of her own lawsuit, from her own emails, and it ended with her apologizing to the Court of Appeal. Let's establish the case itself, because the headline result genuinely was a victory for Meghan, and that has to be stated clearly and up front. In 2018, a few months after her wedding, Meghan wrote a private handwritten letter to her estranged father, Thomas Markle, asking him to stop talking to the tabloids and making false claims about her. In 2019, the Mail on Sunday published extracts of that letter. Meghan sued the publisher for breach of privacy and copyright, and she won comprehensively. A High Court judge ruled in her favor without even needing a full trial, finding that the contents of the letter were personal and private and not a matter of legitimate public interest. The publisher appealed and lost again. 3 senior judges upheld the ruling. The court found that Meghan had a reasonable expectation of privacy in her own letter to her own father, and that splashing it across a newspaper was unlawful. Meghan called it a victory not just for her but for anyone who had ever felt scared to stand up for what was right, and a precedent against a tabloid industry she said profited from cruelty. On the central legal question, she was vindicated. That is real, and it matters. But the path to that victory ran through the testimony of a now familiar figure, and it exposed something that complicated Meghan's image as the straightforward victim of tabloid intrusion. The figure was Jason Knauf, the same Jason Knauf who had written the bullying complaint, and in the appeal the newspaper's lawyers relied on a witness statement from him, accompanied by a trove of emails and texts between him and Meghan, that opened a window into how the supposedly purely private letter had actually been conceived. Here is what Knauf's evidence showed, and it is genuinely awkward for the privacy narrative. According to his witness statement, when Meghan was drafting the letter to her father, she discussed it with him as her communications secretary, and in those discussions she indicated an awareness that the letter might become public. By Knauf's account, Meghan told him that everything she had drafted was written with the understanding that it could be leaked. Even more strikingly, he said she had asked him whether she should address her father as Daddy in the letter, reasoning that in the unfortunate event it leaked, the word would pull at the heartstrings. The newspaper's lawyers argued that this showed the letter was not the purely private communication it had been presented as, but a document crafted at least in part, with the possibility of a public readership in mind, considered carefully so that if her father did leak it, the public would read it sympathetically. Now the court ultimately decided this did not change the fundamental legal point. Even a carefully written letter is still private, and publishing it was still a breach. Meghan won anyway. So on the law, the Knauf evidence did not save the newspaper, but on the question of Meghan's candor, it did real damage, and not because of the letter, because of a separate issue the same evidence exposed. For a long time, Meghan and Harry had denied that they cooperated with the authors of Finding Freedom, the sympathetic 2020 biography of the couple. The denial mattered, because the book read like an authorized account, and the couple's insistence that they had nothing to do with it was part of their public posture of being unfairly defined by others. But Knauf's disclosed emails told a different story. They showed that Meghan had in fact authorized Knauf to brief the book's authors, that she had provided him with background points about her own life to pass along, in one email reportedly copying out a list of topics and adding the briefing points she wanted shared. The cooperation she and Harry had denied was documented in her own correspondence, and so Meghan was forced to do something remarkable for someone in the middle of winning a high-profile case. She apologized to the court. In a statement to the Court of Appeal, she said she accepted that Knauf had provided information to the authors with her knowledge, that she had not had the benefit of seeing these emails when she made her earlier statements, and that she apologized to the court for the fact that she had not remembered these exchanges. She insisted she had no wish or intention to mislead anyone, but the words on the record are unambiguous. She apologized to the court for what it had been told. This is the moment that cannot be dismissed, and it is why this part matters so much to the whole story. Set aside the bullying allegations which were never tested in court. Set aside the anonymous sources and the institutional enemies and the tabloid agendas. Here in a case Meghan herself initiated, examined by senior judges, based on her own emails, the record shows a gap between what Meghan's side had told the court and what her own correspondence revealed, a gap significant enough to require a formal apology. And the person who surfaced it was, once again, Jason Knauf. Which brings us back to the wall that the smear campaign defense can never get over, now reinforced by everything in this part. Meghan's central explanation for the bullying complaint is that Knauf was part of a coordinated effort to destroy her. But in this courtroom, Knauf's evidence appeared in a case where, on the main question, his disclosures did not prevent Meghan from winning. He was a witness whose evidence was used by the newspaper, yes, but the fuller picture is stranger and more damning for the smear theory than that. This was a man who had worked closely for the couple, who knew the inner workings of their communications, and who, when placed under the obligations of a court, produced documents that simply showed what had happened. He did not invent, he disclosed. And what he disclosed happened to be true and happened to embarrass Meghan. A man fabricating a smear produces lies that fall apart. A man telling the truth produces emails that force an apology. There is a sympathetic frame here too, and it is worth stating properly rather than waving away. Memory is genuinely fallible. It is entirely possible that Meghan, swamped by the chaos of those years, honestly did not remember the specifics of emails sent long before, and that her apology was sincere and her error innocent. People misremember their own past, especially under stress, especially years later. The court did not find that she lied deliberately. It accepted her apology and ruled in her favor on the substance. To leap from her account did not match her emails. To she is a calculated liar would be to overreach exactly the way the tabloids overreached against her. The honest reading is narrower and therefore stronger. On at least one documented occasion in her own case, Meghan's public account diverged from the paper trail to a degree that required a formal apology to a court. That is a fact. What it means about her character is for you to weigh, but weigh it alongside everything else. The pattern we have traced is not built on any single pillar. It is the convergence of independent things, a written complaint from the calmest man in the building, the trapped silence of the Queen's most loyal aide, an investigation buried rather than published, a tearful rift with the one woman who was her equal, a family that collectively signaled it did not accept her account, and now a courtroom record showing that her public version and her private emails did not align. Any one of these, alone, could be explained away. The defenders have a real answer for each. What grows harder with every part is explaining all of them at once, as a coincidence, as a series of unrelated misfortunes that happened to befall one woman across a decade and 2 continents, while the people around her kept arriving independently at the same uncomfortable conclusion. We are not finished. There is still the question of the wider deals, the Netflix and Spotify ventures that were meant to be Meghan's vindication and instead produced their own pattern of friction and collapse. There is the rupture between 2 brothers that may never heal. And there is the largest question of all, the one that has hovered over this entire account and that we owe you a direct answer to. Is any of this actually unique to Meghan, or do all royal households chew up the people who serve them? That is where we are going. Subscribe, because we are entering the final stretch, and it is where the whole pattern either holds together or falls apart. When Harry and Meghan left the monarchy in 2020, the story they told themselves and the world was one of liberation. Freed from the cold institution, freed from the hostile courtiers, freed from the press pack, they would finally build something of their own, on their own terms, where Meghan's vision could flourish without the dead hand of protocol holding her back. The deals came fast and they came enormous. A reported $100 million arrangement with Netflix, a $20 million podcasting deal with Spotify, a 4-book publishing contract. This was to be the proof that the problem had never been Meghan, the problem had been the palace. Now unshackled, she would show everyone what she could do. So consider what actually happened to those deals, because the pattern that haunted Kensington Palace and then Montecito did not stop at the staff. It extended to the partners, the corporations. the powerful, sophisticated commercial entities who signed up eagerly to be in business with the most famous couple in the world, and who, in case after case, ended up frustrated, disappointed, or openly contemptuous. Start with Spotify because Spotify is the clearest case and the most brutal. The deal was worth a reported $20 million. In exchange, the audio giant expected a flow of content, a slate of programming worthy of that investment. What it got, over the life of the deal, was one podcast series, Meghan's Archetypes, a show built around interviews with high-profile women about the labels that hold them back, featuring guests like Serena Williams and Mariah Carey and Paris Hilton. The show was not a failure with audiences. It landed well, it won a People's Choice Award, it found listeners, but it was, in volume, a trickle where Spotify had paid for a flood, 12 episodes and a holiday special. Then the deal ended. By mutual agreement, the partnership dissolved. And then a senior Spotify executive said out loud what corporate partners almost never say out loud. Bill Simmons, the head of podcast innovation at Spotify, a man who had sold his own company to the platform for $200 million, went on his own show and called Harry and Meghan, in the crudest possible terms, grifters. He said the podcast they should have made with the couple was one called The Grifters. He talked about a Zoom call he had had with Harry to help brainstorm podcast ideas, describing it as one of his best stories, the implication being that the ideas or the effort had been thin. He had said earlier that he was so tired of Harry asking what the prince actually brought to the table, suggesting that nobody cared what he had to say about anything except the royal family. Now you have to weigh this carefully because Simmons is one man. He was clearly angry, and his language was deliberately provocative. He is not a neutral witness. He is a frustrated executive venting. And there is a strong counterpoint that the couple's defenders make, which is simply this: the content sold. The Netflix documentary Harry and Meghan became one of the most watched documentaries in the platform's history, drawing tens of millions of viewing hours and, by some accounts, helping Netflix add millions of subscribers in the quarter it dropped. Harry's memoir, Spare, became the fastest-selling non-fiction book ever recorded. Whatever Simmons thought, the public was buying. By the cold logic of commerce, the couple delivered audiences even when they did not deliver volume. The grifter label, the defenders say, is just a sore executive's insult, and the numbers prove the couple's value. That is a fair rebuttal, and it has to be granted. But notice what it concedes and what it cannot reach. It concedes that the productivity problem was real. Spotify did not pay $20 million for one well-received series. It paid for a slate that never materialized. The defense that the content sold answers a different question than the one Simmons raised. Simmons was not saying the couple had no audience. He was saying they had not done the work, that the relationship had been all promise and little delivery, that the effort on the inside did not match the value on the marquee. And that complaint, stripped of his crude language, rhymes with something we have heard before. The staff who could not stay, the partners who came away feeling they had given more than they got. A consistent gap between the dazzling exterior and the experience of actually working alongside the operation. The Netflix relationship too has had its strains. The headline documentary was a hit, but the broader $100 million partnership produced far less than its scale implied for a long stretch, with project after project announced and then quietly shelved or cancelled. Before Meghan's lifestyle series With Love, Meghan eventually arrived to mixed reception. An animated series Meghan had developed was scrapped. The pattern again was of grand announcements followed by thin delivery, of a commercial machine that struggled to convert its enormous advantages into a steady stream of finished work. There was a small telling detail in the Spotify saga that captures the whole dynamic. Meghan, for her Archetypes podcast, personally wrote to Taylor Swift, inviting her onto the show. Swift, through a representative, declined. We do not know why, and it would be unfair to read too much into a single scheduling decision by a famously selective superstar, but it sits inside a larger picture in which the doors that Meghan's fame should have opened did not always open, in which the collaborations that should have been easy proved difficult, in which the most connected woman in the world kept encountering friction where there should have been flow. Here is the honest reading of the commercial years, holding both truths at once. Harry and Meghan demonstrably have value. They draw audiences, they sell books, they move subscriber numbers, and any company would still take a meeting. That is real, and the grifter insult is too cheap to be the whole story. But alongside that genuine commercial pull runs the same thread we have followed from the beginning: a difficulty in the actual working relationship, a tendency for partners to come away frustrated, a gap between the promise and the delivery, and at least one major partner whose senior executive was angry enough to torch the couple in public. The institution blaming theory predicted that, free of the palace, the friction would vanish. Instead, in deal after deal, with sophisticated American corporations who had no stake in any royal feud, the friction reappeared. And the friction was not only commercial, it was at the deepest level, personal and familial. And it had a specific origin point that nearly everyone who has studied this family traces back to the same source. The breakdown between two brothers who had once been inseparable, the boys who walked behind their mother's coffin together, the rupture that may now be permanent. And at the center of that rupture, by the account of nearly every observer and by Harry's own telling, was a single subject they could never get past. That subject was Meghan, the brothers, and what tore them apart is where we go next. If you have ever wondered how two brothers bound by the worst day of their childhood ended up separated by an ocean and a silence, the next part is for you. Subscribe so it reaches you. Of everything Meghan has been accused of touching, nothing carries more weight than this, because nothing was more precious. William and Harry were not just brothers. They were two boys who lost their mother in the most public tragedy of the modern age, who walked behind Diana's coffin through silent crowds while the world watched, who had only each other to understand what that was like. If you wanted to identify the single most important relationship in Prince Harry's life, it was his brother. And it is now, by every available account, broken perhaps beyond repair. The question that matters for our story is how much of that breakage runs through Meghan. Be careful here, because this is the place where it is easiest to be unfair. Brothers fall out for 1,000 reasons that have nothing to do with anyone's wife. The rivalry between an heir and a spare is structural, ancient, built into the very architecture of monarchy, and Harry has written movingly about how that structure wounded him long before Meghan appeared. He has described feeling like the lesser son, the backup, the joker, traumatized by his mother's death and by a family he felt never helped him process it. Much of Harry's pain predates Meghan entirely, and to lay it all at her feet would be both cruel and false. The defenders are right that the brothers' relationship had fault lines running back to childhood, but trace the timeline of the actual rupture, the hardening from ordinary sibling tension into permanent estrangement, and Meghan appears at every hinge point. By the accounts of multiple royal historians, William's first real unease came early, when he warned Harry that he might be moving too fast with Meghan, that the engagement was coming quickly. Harry, in spare, recounts this warning and clearly experienced it as a betrayal, as his brother failing to simply be happy for him. From William's side, by these accounts, it was an older brother's caution. From Harry's side, it was the first sign that the family would not accept the woman he loved. Whichever reading you take, the point is the same. The very first crack in the brothers' adult relationship opened over Meghan. Then came the period around the wedding, and the bridesmaid dispute we have already examined, which by several accounts hardened the chill between the two households. Then came something more direct. By the timeline reconstructed from Harry's own memoir and royal reporting, the two couples tried, that summer, to sit down at William and Kate's home and talk through their growing differences. The conversation went badly. It became inflamed. By Harry's account, William accused Meghan of being rude in the run-up to the wedding, and the exchange grew so heated that Meghan told William, in words that have since become famous, to kindly take his finger out of her face. This was no longer cold protocol. This was a future king and his brother's wife, in a private home, in open conflict. And then comes the detail that places Meghan's treatment of staff directly at the heart of the brothers' war, and it comes from Harry's own book. By Harry's account, over that same period, as Kensington Palace staff reportedly split into rival camps loyal to one couple or the other, William told Harry directly that Meghan had been mistreating employees. Sit with the significance of that. The bullying allegation was not only something that travelled up the chain to private secretaries and HR departments. It was something the future King of England raised with his own brother, to his face, as a concern about his brother's wife. William, by this account, believed it. He believed it enough to say it to Harry, and Harry, defending his wife, experienced it as one more attack from a family determined to reject her. The same allegation seen from two sides: to William a real concern about real stuff, to Harry a smear against the woman he loved. There is the entire tragedy in a single conversation. From there the descent was steady and it now seems irreversible. Harry teared up at a public awards appearance and, by his account, it triggered a 72-hour argument with William by text, an argument Harry says he has saved and still rereads, full of his brother telling him he needed help, that he was perhaps being brainwashed in therapy, intercut with declarations that he loved him and would do anything for him. Then the Sandringham summit, where the terms of the couple's departure were thrashed out. Then the move to America. Then the Oprah interview, which William and Kate, as we saw, helped craft the institution's steely response to. Then the Netflix documentary. Then Spare, in which Harry alleged, among much else, that William had physically attacked him during an argument about Meghan, knocking him to the floor. By the time the memoir landed, royal experts were describing the brothers' relationship as being at an all-time low, with one senior source saying they were not even speaking, and others saying there was no real trust left and no reconciliation expected. The estrangement has only calcified since. William, by repeated accounts, feels betrayed, feels he cannot trust Harry or Meghan again after the interviews in the book, and has maintained a frosty, deliberate silence. Royal commentators have described the future king as feeling that the couple's willingness to air every private grievance in public made reconciliation nearly impossible. Harry, for his part, has spoken of wanting reconciliation, has said life is too precious to keep fighting, has expressed regret and a longing to mend things, particularly with his ailing father. But the distance, as one royal historian put it, is more than an ocean. There are, by most accounts, no concrete plans for the brothers to reconcile. Now, the fairest possible frame for Meghan's role in all this, and it deserves full statement, is that she was the catalyst rather than the cause. In this reading, the brothers' relationship was always going to fracture under the weight of the heir and spare structure, the unprocessed grief over Diana, the fundamentally different lives they were destined to lead. Meghan did not invent those fault lines. She simply arrived at the moment they were ready to give way, and a family that should have rallied around a new member instead treated her as a threat, forcing Harry to choose between his wife and his birth family. In that frame, the villain is not Meghan and not even William, but a poisonous institution that could not accommodate an outsider and made Harry pay for loving one. This is essentially Harry's own view, and it is held sincerely and argued powerfully. But hold it against the through line, because the through line does not bend. The same thing we have seen everywhere appears here too, in the most intimate setting of all. Wherever Meghan goes, relationships that were stable before her arrival come under strain after it. The staff, the sister-in-law, the corporate partners, and now the one bond that should have been unbreakable, the bond between two brothers forged in the worst loss imaginable. You can argue fairly that she was the catalyst and not the cause, but a catalyst that appears at the center of every single rupture, across every domain of a person's life, eventually stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a common factor. That is not a verdict. It is the question the pattern forces, and an honest viewer has to sit with it. Which brings us at last to the objection that has been waiting in the wings this entire time, the single most powerful defense of Meghan that we have not yet fully confronted. Maybe none of this is about Meghan at all. Maybe royal households simply destroy the people in and around them. Maybe every royal burns through staff, fractures their family, and leaves a trail of casualties, and Meghan only looks unusual because she is the one the press chose to hate. Before we can reach any honest conclusion, we have to test that objection seriously, because if it holds, the entire pattern collapses. That test is where we go next. Subscribe, because the next part is where we find out whether the case against Meghan survives its strongest challenge. Here is the objection, stated as strongly as it can be, because a fair reckoning demands we build the counter-argument at full strength before we test it. Royal service is notoriously brutal. The pay is poor, the hours are merciless, the deference is suffocating, and the scrutiny is total. Staff turnover across all royal households is genuinely high. Every senior royal has lost aides, weathered resignations, and generated the occasional unflattering story about their temper or their demands. The institution itself is the meat grinder, so perhaps Meghan is not exceptional at all. Perhaps she is simply the royal the British press decided, for reasons that include her race, her nationality, and her refusal to conform, to destroy. Pick any royal, scrutinize them as relentlessly as Meghan was scrutinized, brief against them as persistently, and you would find the same trail of departed staff and strained relationships. The pattern in this reading is not Meghan, it is the camera, pointed only at her. This is the best defense, and it is not a weak one, so let's test it properly, by actually looking at how the institution has treated comparable cases, because the institution's own behavior is the control group. Start with the most obvious comparison, the one that demolishes the simplest version of the press bias argument. Prince Andrew. If the British press and the royal machine were simply in the business of protecting their own and savaging outsiders, then Andrew, the Queen's own son, blood royal, the ultimate insider, should have been shielded. Instead, the institution turned on him with a coldness that makes the treatment of Meghan look almost gentle. Andrew was stripped of his honorary military titles, lost his royal patronages, was effectively expelled from public life, and was eventually pressured out of his titles and his home entirely amid the Epstein scandal. The press pursued him without mercy, the family cut him loose without sentiment. This is the same institution, the same press ecosystem, and it proved perfectly willing to destroy a born royal when it judged the cause sufficient. The machine does not only eat outsiders. The bias argument, in its crude form, cannot survive the Andrew comparison. But that is the easy case because Andrew's conduct was in a different universe of seriousness. The more honest comparison is with the working royals whose only offense was the ordinary friction of demanding personalities, and here the defense gets its strongest footing. So we have to be scrupulous. King Charles, as Prince of Wales, was famously demanding of his staff. There are documented accounts of his exacting standards, his temper, his elaborate requirements. Other royals have had their difficult boss stories, so it is simply true that Meghan is not the only royal whose staff found them hard to work for. The category of demanding royal employer is real and well populated, and Meghan belongs to it alongside others. That much the defense establishes cleanly. Where the defense breaks down is in the specifics, and the specifics are what this entire account has been built on. Because the case against Meghan is not merely that she was a demanding employer. Demanding employers do not generate formal written bullying complaints from their own communications secretaries, sent up the chain to the future king's office, sourced to report after report from multiple witnesses. Demanding employers do not trigger externally conducted, monarch-funded investigations that interview 10 staff and then bury the findings while quietly changing the bullying policy. Demanding employers do not produce a body of former staff who collectively nickname themselves survivors. The Charles comparison establishes that Meghan was a hard boss. It does not begin to explain the formal, documented institutional machinery that her conduct specifically set in motion, machinery that was not activated for the merely demanding. And then comes the fact that the "it's just the Crown" defense cannot absorb at all, the fact we have returned to again and again because it is the load-bearing beam of the entire case. Meghan left the Crown, she left the institution, the press pack, the courtiers, the protocol, all of it. She built a new life in California with her own hand-picked staff and her own commercial partners, in a country with no royal deference and no British tabloid stranglehold. And the pattern continued. The staff kept leaving, the partners kept souring. A Spotify executive called her a grifter. Chiefs of staff quit within months. The former employees of a private American foundation, not a royal household, were the ones reaching for the language of survival and trauma. If the cause were truly the Crown, removing the Crown should have ended it. It did not. The one variable that remained constant when everything else changed was Meghan herself. So weigh the defense honestly. Is royal service brutal? Yes. Is staff turnover high across all households? Yes. Was Meghan scrutinized more harshly and with an uglier edge than perhaps any royal in modern memory? Almost certainly yes. And that scrutiny was often genuinely unfair and sometimes carried a racial charge that shames the people who trafficked in it. Every one of those things is true, and none of them should be surrendered to make the case against her cleaner. The press treatment of Meghan was in significant part a disgrace, and yet none of it accounts for the totality. The Andrew case proves the machine eats insiders too, so Meghan was not uniquely targeted as an outsider. The Charles comparison proves she was a demanding boss but cannot explain the formal bullying machinery she uniquely triggered. And the California years prove the pattern was not the Crown's doing because it survived her escape from the Crown. When you line up every available comparison, the "it's just the institution" defense explains a great deal of the noise around Meghan and almost none of the signal. It accounts for why she was hated more than others. It does not account for why the people closest to her in every setting across 2 continents, inside the institution and outside it, kept arriving at the same conclusion and kept leaving. We have now tested the case against its strongest challengers. We have given the defenders their fullest hearing on the bridesmaid dispute, the Oprah response, the courtroom apology, the commercial deals, the brothers' rift, and the institutional comparison. We have conceded everything that honesty requires us to concede. What remains after all the concessions is a pattern that the concessions cannot dissolve. It is time to put it all together, fairly, completely, and to say as precisely as the evidence allows what this whole story actually amounts to, and what it does not. That final reckoning is where we end. One last subscribe, because the conclusion is where every thread we have followed finally ties together. If everything we have traced so far were confined to the past, to 2018 and the royal years and the immediate aftermath, you could perhaps file it away as ancient history, a difficult chapter long closed. But in 2025, a new woman stepped forward, in an entirely new setting, with an entirely new version of the same accusation, and she did it not as an anonymous source but on camera, under her own name, as the chair of a charity that Prince Harry himself. In March 2025, the relationship detonated. Harry and Prince Saiso announced their resignation as patrons of the charity, amid a dispute with the board and with Chandauka. The framing at first was that Harry was stepping away in dismay at problems with the chair, and then Chandauka did something almost no one in Meghan and Harry's orbit had done before. She refused to go quietly, and she turned the accusation around. Speaking to Sky News, Chandauka alleged that Harry had unleashed what she called the Sussex machine on her, that when he resigned he authorized the release of damaging information to the outside world without informing her or her country directors or her executive director, and that the effect of that on her and on the hundreds of people connected to the charity amounted to, in her words, harassment and bullying at scale. She filed a complaint with the Charity Commission alleging bullying, harassment and misogyny, including misogynoir, the specific prejudice directed at black women. The accuser this time was not a frightened 20-something assistant. She was a lawyer who knew exactly how to fight back, and she did. Now here is where Meghan enters, and where the detail becomes genuinely striking. According to reporting in the Daily Mail and elsewhere, the deeper origin of the conflict was not Harry at all. It was Meghan. A source claimed that the problem started with Meghan, that Meghan simply did not like Sophie Chandauka, and that the charity's unraveling traced back to that personal dislike. The flashpoint that gets cited repeatedly is a polo fundraiser in Florida in April 2024, the Royal Salute Polo Challenge, which Chandauka had organized in her role as chair. By Chandauka's account, the event was already strained because Harry had wanted to bring a Netflix crew to film his polo series, which drove up venue costs and forced a scramble. And then, Chandauka said, Meghan, who had indicated she would not attend, turned up anyway, and brought a very famous friend, the tennis star Serena Williams, with her, late and unannounced. What happened on that stage became a small, telling emblem of the whole dynamic, and crucially, it was captured on video. So it is not merely a matter of competing accounts. As the group assembled for the trophy presentation, with Chandauka, the charity's chair, standing in her rightful place beside Harry, Meghan can be heard on the footage redirecting her. Meghan asks Chandauka whether she wants to come over to stand next to her instead, effectively moving the chair of the charity out of her position next to the prince. By Chandauka's account, the choreography went badly because there were suddenly too many people on the stage, the unplanned arrivals having disrupted the careful arrangement. It is a tiny moment, But it shows on camera Meghan reorganizing a charity's own event around herself, repositioning the woman who ran it. To Chandauka, it was emblematic of exactly the dynamic that would later curdle into her bullying complaint. So weigh this carefully and fairly, because it is genuinely contested and the counter-arguments are real and strong. First, the accusations here were leveled primarily at Harry, not Meghan, and Harry's side has its own account. But step back from the question of who was right inside centre bail and look at the shape of the thing, because the shape is the point. Here in 2025, years after the palace, years after the move to California, in a brand new organization, with a brand new highly accomplished woman, the same pattern materialized once more. A capable woman enters the couple's orbit. Friction develops, and the friction by multiple accounts traces back to Meghan's personal dislike. The relationship collapses, and the woman walks away alleging bullying and harassment. Whether or not Chandauka was right about the merits, the recurrence of the pattern is the striking fact. The same story, the same accusation, the same collapse, with the principles and the setting swapped out but the central figure unchanged. By 2025, this was no longer a royal story or an institutional story. It was a story that had followed Meghan through every chapter of her life, into every organization she touched, attached to a steady procession of women who entered confident and left embittered. And the women who paid the price were not only employees and colleagues and charity chairs, some of them shared her blood, because the same pattern of rupture that defined Meghan's professional life also consumed her own family, leaving her estranged from her father and locked in litigation with her sister, in a breakdown so total that her father has never met his royal grandchildren. That family estrangement, and what it adds to the picture, is where we go next. Subscribe, because the story of how Meghan lost her own father is in some ways the saddest chapter of all. There is a question that quietly undermines every sympathetic explanation we have considered, and it is uncomfortable enough that Meghan's defenders rarely engage it directly. If the friction in Meghan's life were truly the product of a cold royal institution, or a racist British press, or jealous courtiers, then how do we explain the fact that she is also estranged from her own father, locked in a lawsuit with her own half-sister, and by most accounts alienated from nearly her entire side of the family? The palace did not create the Markle family rift. The tabloids did not invent it. It predates her royal life and has outlasted it, and it follows the same shape as everything else. Be fair first, because the Markle family is genuinely complicated and Meghan has real grievances that deserve acknowledgement. Her father, Thomas Markle, a former Hollywood lighting director, did something in the days before her wedding that was by any reasonable standard a betrayal. He was caught having staged photographs with the paparazzi for money. When the deception was exposed, he experienced a heart attack, was hospitalized, and did not attend the wedding at all. In the aftermath, rather than retreating into private repair, he gave a series of interviews criticizing his daughter, airing family matters in the press at the worst possible moment. From Meghan's side, this was a parent selling her out to the media she was already at war with, and her anger and her sense of betrayal were entirely understandable. No one should pretend Thomas Markle behaved well. He did not. And her half-sister Samantha Markle has been a relentless public critic, writing a book, giving countless interviews, and positioning herself as a wronged sibling. Samantha sued Meghan for but notice once again what the pattern reveals when you stop looking at any single relationship and look at the whole. It is not just her father, it is not just one sister, it is by all accounts nearly the entire Markle side of her family, with whom she has comprehensively cut ties. And the mechanism of the estrangement rhymes precisely with the mechanism we have seen everywhere else. Consider what emerged from her own lawsuit against the Mail on Sunday, the documents we examined earlier. In the same trove of emails that forced her apology to the court, it was revealed that Meghan had authorized her aide, Jason Knauf, to brief the authors of Finding Freedom with background about her relationship with Samantha, sending him notes about her half-sister. Court filings indicate Meghan told Knauf things about Samantha, including claims about her children and custody that Samantha says are false, and that became part of the libel complaint. Whatever the legal outcome, the picture is of Meghan managing the narrative about her family member through a communications operation, the same operation that staff would later describe as the Sussex machine, the same machine Sophie Shandauka would later say was turned on her. And the human cost here is stark in a way the professional casualties are not, because this is blood. Thomas Markle, now in his 80s, has never met his grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet. He suffered a serious health crisis in late 2025, hospitalized in the Philippines and undergoing a leg amputation following a blood clot, and only at that point, after 7 years of total silence, did Meghan reportedly reach out to him. 7 years. A father and daughter who had been close, who had not exchanged a word in 7 years, the grandchildren growing up entirely unknown to him. The estrangement was so complete that Thomas at one point threatened to give a media interview every single month until his daughter agreed to speak to him and offered to testify against her in his other daughter's lawsuit. This is a family in ruins. The defender's response is that families fracture, that estrangement is common, that a person is entitled to cut off relatives who hurt them or sell them out, and that Meghan's choices about her own toxic family are nobody's business and certainly not evidence of any pattern. There is real truth in that. Plenty of decent people are estranged from difficult parents and siblings, and it would be wrong to treat family estrangement on its own as proof of anything. People have the right to protect themselves from family members who harm them, but the family estrangement does not stand on its own. It stands at the end of a very long line, and that is what gives it weight. By itself, a daughter cutting off a father who staged paparazzi photos is understandable. By itself, winning a lawsuit against a litigious half-sister is just self-defense. But place the family rift alongside the departed staff, the trapped private secretary, the tearful future queen, the soured corporate partners, the estranged. We have now assembled the entire picture. The royal staff, the queen's aide, the bridesmaid dispute, the Oprah claims and the institution's response, the courtroom apology, the corporate partners, the estranged brother, the newest woman, the charity chair, and now the family. The blood relations estranged across decades. We have given the defenders their fullest hearing at every stage and conceded everything honesty requires. What remains, after all the concessions, is a pattern too consistent and too cross-cutting to dissolve. It is time finally to put all of it together and say as precisely as the evidence allows what this whole story amounts to, and, just as importantly, what it does not. That final reckoning is where we end. One last subscribe before the conclusion, because the final part is where every thread we have followed finally ties together. We have come a very long way, and I am not going to insult you now by pretending the evidence delivers a clean verdict, because it does not, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a side rather than the truth. What the evidence delivers is a pattern, and a pattern is a different thing from a proof. So let me lay out, as plainly and as fairly as I can, what we actually know, what we genuinely do not, and what the honest weight of all of it comes to. Begin with what we do not know, because intellectual honesty demands it go first and loudest. We do not know what the palace investigation found, because its conclusions were sealed and may never be released. We have never seen Meghan formally answer the bullying allegations point by point in a neutral forum, because no such forum was ever convened. Many of the harshest descriptions, especially the ones from California, are anonymous, and anonymous claims can be exaggerated, recycled, or planted by people with agendas. The bridesmaid dispute remains a genuine collision of accounts in which, by the most credible telling, both women cried, and both said things they regretted. The leak of the bullying complaint, timed for the eve of the Oprah interview, was by every indication a hostile and calculated act, which means we should hold the leaker's motives in deep suspicion. And the press treatment of Meghan was, across years, frequently brutal and sometimes carried a racial edge that was indefensible. Every one of these things is true. Hold all of them. Now hold the strongest version of Meghan's defense in full, because it has earned a fair hearing and not a grudging one. She was an outsider dropped into the most rigid institution in the Western world, an institution that, by her husband's detailed and consistent testimony, contained people who resented her and briefed against her. The British press hunted her with a viciousness that shames the country that produced it. She was isolated, pregnant, and unsupported during the worst of it, and she has said she was driven to thoughts of suicide and denied help, a claim that should chill anyone who hears it. The label difficult has been pinned on ambitious women since the beginning of time, and the same drive that gets a man called a strong leader gets a woman called a tyrant. Suffering is real even when it is not the whole story. And on the one occasion her conduct was tested in open court, in her own privacy case she won, comprehensively on a principle that genuinely matters. Every one of these points is true. None should be minimized to make the story tidier. And now, against all of that, the thing the defense cannot dissolve. There is a pattern, and the pattern has a shape that the institution-blaming frame cannot fully contain. The central complaint was written by Jason Knauf, the calmest and most credible figure in the building, through official channels not leaked by him, describing not one incident but a stream of them, sourced to multiple witnesses, serious enough that the head of HR agreed, and structural enough that he asked whether the institution's rules even applied to royals. And the same man later disclosed documents in court that supported Meghan's privacy victory, while simultaneously exposing that her public account had diverged from her own emails, which means he cannot be filed away as an enemy running a smear. He was the truthful witness, whose truth happens to be inconvenient. The most unshakable figure of all, Samantha Cohen, the Queen's own aide of nearly 2 decades, loyal and discreet to a fault, was trapped in a 6-month assignment for 18 months because no one would replace her, was interviewed in the formal investigation, and eventually, carefully, reluctantly, confirmed the hard thing was real, without ever cashing in or embellishing. The investigation that should have settled everything was conducted by an outside firm funded by the Queen herself, drew on around 10 witnesses, and then produced not an exoneration but a quiet change to the institution's anti-bullying policy and a permanent seal on its findings. Institutions that find nothing tend to say so. Institutions that change their rules while refusing to explain why are behaving like ones that found something they cannot afford to confirm. The bridesmaid dispute, even in its most Meghan-friendly telling, ended with a future queen in tears and words exchanged that needed apologizing for, in a clash with the one woman in the family who was Meghan's structural equal and could not simply be bullied as a junior aide could. The institution itself, in the most carefully deliberated statement it had issued in years, signaled collectively and at the highest level, through the phrase "recollections may vary," that it did not accept Meghan's account as true, with the future king and queen reportedly the ones who insisted on the steal, and then the move to California, the controlled experiment that should have cleared everything up, remove the cold institution, and the friction should ease. Instead it continued, on a new continent, in a household and a set of businesses Meghan herself built and controlled, with staff still leaving in clusters years later, with a major corporate partner's executive calling the couple grifters, and with the former employees calling themselves survivors. Set those things side by side and notice what they have in common. They cannot all be explained by the palace because several of them happened outside the palace, or against the palace's own interest, or in a courtroom Meghan herself chose to enter. The institution-blaming frame is genuinely powerful for the events of 2018, and it accounts honestly for why Meghan was hated more than others. But it has nothing to say about a chief of staff quitting a Santa Barbara foundation in 2024, or about why the Queen's own aide could not be replaced, or about why the architect of the central complaint also aided Meghan's legal defense, or about why her own emails required an apology to a court. When you account for everything the frame cannot reach, you are left with one element present in every version of the story, in every location, across every year, inside the institution and outside it. Honest analysis, which refuses to let either side off the hook, has to at least name that element rather than pretend it isn't there. So here is where I land, and I want to be precise about the strength of the claim, because precision is the entire point of an honest accounting. I cannot tell you that Meghan Markle is a bully, because that word implies a settled finding that no neutral process ever publicly delivered, and I will not hand you a certainty I do not possess. What I can tell you is that the evidence for a serious, persistent problem in how she ran her households and conducted her relationships is far stronger, far better sourced, and far harder to dismiss than her defenders have ever been willing to admit, and that the single explanation which fits all of the facts, the royal years and the California years, the credibility of Knauf and the silence of the report and the apology to the court, is not the one in which she is purely a victim. The smear campaign defense successfully indicts the people who leaked the complaint. It never managed to answer the complaint, and it is possible finally to hold the hardest truth of all, the one that resolves the apparent contradiction at the heart of this whole story. An institution can fail a woman badly, and that woman can also fail the people who worked for her. The British press can be a disgrace, and the bullying complaint can be true. Meghan can be a victim of forces larger and uglier than herself, and she can also have left a trail of frightened, diminished people behind her. These are not contradictions. Suffering does not confer kindness. The wronged can also do wrong. The most honest reading of this entire saga is not that Meghan was a saint martyred by a cruel establishment, nor that she was a monster who fooled the world. It is the more uncomfortable, more human truth that both things happened at once, and that the people who paid the highest price for that collision were not the principals at all. Because in the end, return one last time to them, the people this was actually about, the ones the headlines always forget. The personal assistant who left the wedding she had built, the Queen's aide who could not get free, the third staffer named only by an initial said to have always had someone in her sights, the future Princess of Wales in tears over a child's dress, the grown professionals in California who called themselves survivors, the chiefs of staff and press secretaries and executives whose careers crossed Meghan's and came out altered, the brother forged in the worst loss of his life, now separated by an ocean and a silence. They did not seek fame. Most of them never spoke publicly, and the ones who did spoke carefully, years late, and got no public vindication in return. Their experiences were gathered, weighed in secret, and locked away to keep the peace. That is the cost the title points to, not the cost to Meghan, who remains wealthy, famous, and adored by millions who will never believe a word against her. The cost to them, the ones whose names you mostly do not know, who stood closest to the brightest star in the world and walked away burned, and who are remembered now, in the small worlds they came from, as the Sussex Survivors Club. You have now seen everything I have, the strongest case for her, and the hardest facts against her, laid side by side, with every concession honesty requires and every fact fairness demands. I have given you my honest read, but the verdict was never mine to deliver. It is yours. So tell me down in the comments where you have landed after all of it. The victim, the villain, or the uncomfortable possibility that she was both at once, and that an institution can crush a woman while that same woman crushes the people beneath her. Both true, both real, both part of the same sad story. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If this is the kind of careful, evidence-first storytelling you want more of, subscribing is the single thing that keeps it coming, and it costs you nothing at all. I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.